It's not picking anything now.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to call this July 25th, 2024 Planning Commission meeting to order. First, let's do roll call. Mike Bresco.
Here.
Sudha Sankara.
Here.
John Bachman.
Here.
Syed Safavian.
Here.
Hisham Elkawad.
Here.
Mark Bachman, I am here, and we are missing Ajay Chakrapani, and we'll see if he arrives or not. Next is approval of the agenda for this evening. Any changes to the agenda by anyone? I would like to point out, this isn't really a change, but a clarification. On item 3 of the agenda, says East Lake Development text amendments. We are actually doing a public hearing on that topic. So just for anyone watching this or anybody in the room, there is actually, we'll go through the public hearing process for that item, even though at least on my version of the agenda it doesn't say that. All right, so next we'll do non-agenda public comment. I want to just take one quick second for everybody to remind you how public comment's going to go this evening, because we have a busy list. So there's actually 4 opportunities to make public comment. If it's possible and you can try to fit your public comment in the right slot, that would be wonderful. First, we have non-agenda public comment. We'll do that next. Then we have 2 public hearings, which we will have public comment that is specific to those tasks. The first one on the comp plan, and the second one on the East Lake Development item. And then at the very end, we will do as we typically do, agenda-related public comment. So at that point, the only thing really that should be agenda-related public comment would be the last item of business on our agenda, which is the review of the code modifications. So anyway, there's 4 opportunities for public comment, and I'm looking forward to all of them. Let's start out with non-agenda public comment. Does anyone have non-agenda public comment? Reminder, we're 3 minutes per person. Paul's first.
Rock, paper, scissors, yeah. Good evening, commissioners. Paul Stickney, Sammamish. Want to talk a little bit about affordable housing in the region, just a tad, and some of the metrics that are, behind it that I know of and what I do not know of. I've got a Department of Commerce public records request going that's been ongoing for a year, and they sporadically send me a whole bunch of stuff. And I got the Redmond work that was done on a housing grant that they did back with Commerce in 2021 or 2022. And they had quite a bit of information on affordable housing in their community. And a couple things that were interesting there is they've had a 10% inclusionary on multifamily for quite a while in Redmond. If they said exactly how long, I did not pick up on that. But they have something else interesting. They've had a 10% inclusionary affordable housing requirement on any subdivision over, 10 lots in single family. Now, in general, it's my anecdotal experience that there's far fewer plats over 10 lots than under, but I understand they had a fee in lieu for plats less than that, which is what our city's talking about. What I wanted to share with, and this is not throwing any rocks or stones or being negative or positive, it's being factual, and I don't know how to interpret all this. Redmond, interestingly enough, oh, that's interesting, I grabbed all the things I needed except their sheet. I'll be close. They've had about 700 inclusionary houses affordable and about 600 through a multifamily tax exemption or other things, so around 1,300 units since 1994. And the interesting thing was they put in a metric in their plan that they had, as of 2020 or 2021, I can't recall which, they've had 44 units of affordable housing per 1,000 units. Issaquah is in the neighborhood of 32. No rocks, no stones. What's the Sammamish number? It is 2.5. So the thing I'm after is the reality of the feasibility of inclusionary. I think it's pretty feasible on the bonus parcels. I don't think it's feasible in centers unless there's market rate attached. So that's my affordable comment. All right.
Thanks, Paul. Who's next? Mary?
Hi, Mary Wichter, Sammamish for 24 years. Just a couple topics that have been touched on through public comment or through subjects on Planning Commission recently. First one I'll do is trees. The tree regulations were done as an emergency ordinance in 2014 was the first year. And through the reading of our director, David Pyle, who's really great at code, in critical areas, like landslide and steep slopes, you're supposed to keep, I believe, 100% of the trees. So if you're doing something on a steep slope and it actually gets identified as a steep slope, you're supposed to keep those trees. So another one of my concerns is if you're not identifying slopes or steep slopes, you end up with people who end up putting water on those, and then we end up with landslide hazard areas in any site that's existing, like in Inglewood and Tamarack, where the lots are 10,000 square feet or 2,500 square feet as the smallest, if they're not fragments. People are not necessarily doing that. And then I know of at least 2 lots where for a single house to build, they took out 45 significant trees for a single house. And each of those usually had trouble building and sold multiple times and may have foreclosed once, twice, or 4 times. So it's really important that we try to look at, yeah, in town center you might lose some trees, but you know the replanting is going to occur there through that. They're not happening in the small areas because the people, when they foreclose, there's no bond or anything and you can't get it done. So I think looking at trees is really important. The other thing is wherever you have tree canopy or areas where, like wetlands or streams, where the wildlife can go, the wildlife will always go and they will change where they're going, but they will try to connect where water is first. In King County, on King County IMAP, if you click on environmentally sensitive areas and you scroll down, there's a wildlife network that you can turn on. It makes some little yellow dots kind of through the center of Sammamish. So there is a wildlife network on there. And whenever we're doing wildlife, I think, I grew up in Montana where people have elk and moose in their yards sometimes, which is not a good thing. In fact, if you call in Montana about having large mammals in an urban area, they'll say they're not compatible for the people or for the large mammals. We'd rather have the large mammals go around where the dense or the developments are and go where the waters and the streams and kind of more where the forests are. So in regulations, if there's something that talks about canopy and keeping a connected canopy rather than just letting somebody wipe out the middle of their lot, if they scoot it to the side and give a thing, you can end up with connected canopy even if you're developing. So I just wanted to throw some of those ideas out there because we've had a lot of talk about trees and saving the land. I don't think you need to say town center for the bears to go through the middle of it, and certainly the bobcats don't belong there, but the large mammals will find their way through the wetland areas, and that's what King County's mapping has done. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware of those 2 things. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Anybody else in the room for non-agenda public comment? How about anyone on the meeting?
We don't have anybody online.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to our first item of business this evening, which is a discussion about the 2024 Sammamish Comp Plan. We've talked about this quite a bit, and our goal here this evening is to make a recommendation to the City Council. So let's start out with some presentation with David and Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Chair Boffman. David Pyle, City of Sammamish Department of Community Development Director. With me, I have Jeff Arango, the Framework Planning Director, who is our primary consultant on our comprehensive plan update. Work we've been working on really starting in 2019, but in earnest through contract with Framework and through the public process starting, I think, in 2022, right? We'll talk a little bit about that with the presentation. Jeff's going to provide a presentation, then allow opportunity for dialogue with the commission. Then I believe you're going to open it up to public hearing, and then the commission will have the opportunity to. Sorry, it's been a long day. Deliberate on the issue. I'm sorry, make a motion. That's right. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, who I think is just joined the meeting and is able to pull up his screen and share his screen.
Thank you, David. Let me just get the presentation up here. Okay, great. Thank you. So good evening, Commissioners. Jeff Arango with Framework, and we're going to give a brief overview of the comprehensive plan process and each of the elements. For the presentation, we're going to use a little bit more of a concise version of the boards that we used for the open house, which was on June 20th. This is also the same presentation we gave to the City Council last week. So we got some feedback from them there. So as David just indicated, this process, or at least our work, began in 2022. The actual process predated that, and David will go through some of the background and information on how we got to our growth target and some of the compliance issues related to the Growth Management Act. But one of the first things that we were tasked with is picking up from the work that was done around visioning with the community that predated our work. And through an engagement process with the commission and the council and the community, we came up with a refreshed vision based on the themes of people, planet, and prosperity. So you can see the vision statement there within the middle of the diagram there on the left-hand side of the screen. And then each of those three themes has a set of combined 10 kind of framework goals for the plan that are threaded throughout each of the elements. And that, I think, is really meant to make sure that each of the elements are supporting the community vision and achieving desired outcomes over the 20-year planning period. I'll just also add that this planning process and this periodic update is really quite unprecedented. There's a number of new requirements, and many of those new requirements actually happen after we had already started work on the plan. And there's going to need to be, further refinement and monitoring over time as well. And David can speak to some of that on this next slide here.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So we wanted to take a few minutes and provide an overview to the commission and the community and anyone out there who's listening online of sort of how we got to our growth targets and how we got to what is known as the housing allocation. So we need to think back in time to Puget Sound Regional Council, who is the regional planning authority, metropolitan planning authority of the Puget Sound. And under the Growth Management Act, the Puget Sound Regional Council is responsible for identifying a vision and framework for planning for the region. They put together a document called Puget Sound Regional Council's Vision 2050, which maps the framework for how the region is to grow over time. In order to get to that, they first had their demographers and partner with the state identify how many people would be moving to the region. So they wanted to understand what the growth forecast was with the region through 2050. Then following that, they then aggregated or disaggregated that down to the regional planning level and the county level. And as part of Puget Sound Regional Council's Vision 2050, there are what are known as geography groups and geography cohorts. And those are really groups of cities that are based on attributes of those cities that they were able to logically cluster together for the purpose of planning. It's important to note that Sammamish was placed in the Cities and Towns Urban Geography Group. And the Cities and Towns Group is intended to take less growth in the region than other groups, such as the core cities, the high-capacity transit cities, because those cities in the Cities and Towns Group are missing some of the key characteristics that would basically allow them to take the type of growth that some of the other cities would take. In the case of Sammamish, we lack access to a major highway, access to a freeway. In order to get in and out of the city, we have to go through other jurisdictions who control the roads and intersections in order for us to access the city. In addition to that, the city also lacks some key amenities like retail services. There's also been some challenges in providing and planning for infrastructure in the city historically. We've been through historic moratoriums as a city related to transportation and other infrastructure. So it logically presents that the city should be in the cities and towns category. And it's my understanding that a past mayor also may have advocated for the city to be in the cities and towns category. So as a result of that, the city being in the cities and towns category, that category is only anticipated to take 17,000 units of growth of the overall growth in the region across the 19 cities in the cities and towns category. In order to get to the amount of growth that each city could take, we first go through the growth caucus process, which is dependent on understanding capacity. So in understanding the trajectory of how we got to a growth target, the first thing is to understand first the demographer's forecast of the number of units that are anticipated, the number of people that are forecasted to move to the state. Then we understand the number of those people that are forecasted to move to the Puget Sound. Then we understand the number of people that are forecasted to move to the county. Then at the county level, we look at how to disaggregate that down or break that down into the urban geography groups. Then once we're in the urban geography groups, we then look at how to break that down further into the individual cities, which ultimately results in a city receiving a growth target that gets embedded in King County countywide planning policies. So as part of that process, there's a lot of analysis around what each city brings in terms of capacity. There's a lot of analysis that goes into what each city's attributes and comparison of attributes. However, size is not the only attribute that's considered. There are other attributes that must be considered, such as status and availability of infrastructure, status and availability of services, jobs and housing balance. And also another one that was considered with this last caucus process was access to major transportation infrastructure and systems. So when you start to weigh across the board all of the different attributes that are considered through the growth target setting process, you can see how just size alone does not necessarily mean that a city should take a bigger growth target, proportionate to the rest of the cities in that group. There are also other factors, such as a city's aspiration to take on additional growth through, say, an urban growth area, urban growth boundary expansion, a city's appetite to take on growth through things like development agreements, such as Black Diamond, who in that case has entered into a legally binding development agreement to take on more growth. So when you start to look at the targets that some of the other cities have that are in the cities and towns category, that you can't necessarily compare across those cities based on one sole attribute, size. You need to consider that caucus process that resulted in the growth target setting was far more expansive than that and required much more negotiation and understanding of conditions. So moving beyond the growth target setting process, which really took place in the summer of 2021, at that same time, the state was also reviewing and passing House Bill 1220. So right about the time that growth targets were being set in King County countywide planning policies is right about the time the state legislature passed House Bill 1220. And House Bill 1220, if you recall, is the housing allocation, the affordable housing bill that required as part of the Growth Management Act that we start to plan for and accommodate, I guess, if you will, a wider range of development in the different income bands. So what it did is it said that cities need to consider the different needs and income bands according to the state forecasted need, and that there would be a number established related to a city's housing profile. So while the cities already had growth targets established, the county began working on setting that growth profile and that affordable housing or housing allocation, which is a separate number than a growth target. And in 2022, the county finalized, 2023, trying to get the numbers right, the dates right. The county finalized the housing allocation process and assigned through King County countywide planning policies housing allocations, which is a different number than a growth target. So the interesting thing to keep in mind here is that the county had looked at multiple methodologies by which to assign housing allocations, one of which benchmarked it off of our growth targets. Another benchmarked it off of other different attributes. I can't recall exactly, but you can go back into the Puget Sound the GMPC, King County Growth Management Planning Council's minutes, and you can read through the different options that were considered. The point being is that they had to figure out a methodology by which to identify how many units each city might need to accommodate going forward in order to make up its share of housing in the region. It's really important to remember the difference between a growth target and a housing allocation, that although it might be the same number, they are different. So a growth target is the benchmark that a city uses to plan for delivery of infrastructure and services. For example, traffic concurrency, school concurrency, water and sewer service delivery, adequate parks and open space, And that is the number that we are planning for in this comprehensive plan across a 20-year period to ensure that adequate infrastructure and services are delivered as people arrive in our sort of, as units are delivered and people arrive into the community. So that's really important to keep in mind. That's what a growth target is. A growth target is meant to serve as a method for the city to plan for the delivery of infrastructure and services metered out appropriately across the 20-year period based on the anticipated rate of growth, whereby we can adequately plan for infrastructure for our community. A housing allocation is different, and keep in mind, I'm going to use this term correctly, hopefully, these are not mutually exclusive. They can occur at the same time. They are the same number, but they are different numbers. This is extremely difficult to understand, so I want to make sure to stress this. The housing allocation is a profile of a community that identifies where there are adequate supplies and where there are additional housing types needed. So, and it's broken down into bracketed income groups. So we might, for example, you'll note, based on our housing allocation assigned by the county, have an abundance of higher, 100 and 120 unit or percent and 80 to 100% units, but we might have a deficiency in the lower income bands. And what this is intending to do is to identify and add emphasis to a city's planning efforts when we're planning for housing, that we need to add emphasis to our policies to help promote this type of housing. We need to facilitate through the creation of development regulations that provide adequate capacity and remove barriers to this, to try to steer the housing industry, the construction industry, into providing these types of units. What this is not intended to be is a requirement that we build all of these, that are the other number, our growth target, is built exclusively in these numbers of units. Again, they're mutually exclusive. They're different numbers. They can exist at the same time. Instead, that is meant to be a guide as to where we want to add emphasis in our policies and how we want to adjust our codes to ensure that there is adequate supply and that we've removed the barriers in order to deliver those different types, those categories of housing and those different income bands. So what ends up happening then is the county reviews our plan to make sure that we are consistent across our growth target and our housing allocation. And the county provides feedback to us through this process, which we're currently underway with them on. And if there is a disparity or an inconsistency between the two different categories of countywide planning policies, then they will tell us. So keep in mind that a growth target is in the King County countywide planning policy, and we need to show that we have adequate capacity to account for our growth target, and we need to show that we're adequately planning for the delivery of services and infrastructure to account for that growth target. On the other hand, in a totally different chapter and section of King County countywide planning policies is the housing allocation. And we also need to show that we are adequately amending and providing policy direction to help prioritize that and emphasize that type of housing, and that we are modifying our codes to help facilitate it, and that we have adequate capacity for it should a developer want to build it. So I just wanted to highlight that. There is regionally a lot of confusion about these two categories or these two concepts, the growth target and the housing allocation. And remember that the growth target came from the growth target caucus process that concluded in 2021 and was put in place while the legislature was still working on HB 1220. And what HB 1220 wasn't even a factor yet at that point. The county decided later in the process in allocating housing numbers for housing need that they were going to benchmark that against the housing or against the growth target. So that was their choice to do so. We talked about different methodologies. Again, there were different considerations. So we just want to again highlight that and answer any questions you might have. I've seen a lot of emails come through and a lot of confusion out in the community about that. And I spent a good portion of the day on the phone with King County staff in making sure that my understanding was correct. And it holds true that in all 3 meetings I had today with King County staff from different divisions of King County, that my understanding is correct.
Questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Ajay. Welcome, by the way.
Thank you. Whenever you want to drive to a place and you're getting late to it and you wish all the lights are green, all of those lights go red, one after another, right? And I was coming from Redmond to this place, to the city hall, and as I was coming, I was thinking of the same thing that you mentioned about housing allocation, right? Let's taking a very theoretical approach to compare this to other equivalent cities or equivalent neighborhoods misses one point that Sammamish is unique about, that it is between Redmond and Issaquah, where there are businesses that are growing and there are businesses that have more jobs that are coming and all of those things. So let me posit one particular situation that was coming into my mind. What if there are people with the companies in Redmond as well as in Issaquah who are actually hiring like crazy, and there are people coming just like me, hoping that they will get all the greens and come through, but they're getting the reds and all of those things. And they come and they want to settle down in Sammamish so that they get to that, right? I'm not talking of growth target, but housing allocation wise. If we do that, aren't we then undercutting our next most important factor of missing middle, right? We will then end up creating a situation for the builders that they will just keep building houses or apartments or multimodal housing or whatever it is, but with more features in this one, which will actually push this out of the 50% AMI and get that to a place where only people who are working in these two places in high-tech jobs will be able to afford to get there. Isn't the allocation missing that one point? Aren't we making a risk that 5 years down the line, we come back and we say, in all our good intention, we did this thing, but here's where it went wrong, and we didn't control any of those things, or we could not control any of those things?
Yeah, I think you're getting to the issue of how development and growth will play out versus what we've planned for. And I think some of that goes back to what David just went through and the timing and sequencing of some of the legislation and how this rolled out. And I think part of that is that Sammamish had the growth target set and it showed a dearth or a need for affordable. So the city got a very high percentage of affordable units. We're going to be hopefully setting up a monitoring program. As the diagram on the left indicates, there's going to be opportunities for refinements. But I feel like, given the parameters that we were given, we've done the best we can to plan for that and demonstrate compliance. And, we had even though it feels like forever, we had a couple of years to put the plan together, but the plan's going to be in place for 20 years. And some of that will require some refinements and some monitoring. But to your point, I mean, it could be that market rate development outpaces the affordable housing that we've planned for. I think that's a pretty likely scenario and one that we'll just have to monitor and try to account for. With that said, the city has done, I think, a tremendous job expanding opportunities for affordable housing through the plan in very meaningful ways. And so I think from my perspective, the city's putting forth a really good effort to be able to do that.
I'm not at all questioning what the city's doing. This is great.
Yeah, no,
right? But then what I'm saying is that 5 years down the line, would we have an avenue to go back to the state and say that, hey, you thought of us like we were Black Diamond, or we are a sister to Black Diamond, and we are actually not a sister to Black Diamond. We are becoming a very close cousin to Redmond as far as housing is concerned. And so we are in a completely different phase.
Yeah.
We are now failing on our missing middle goal that we started off with, and we're not going to make that by 2044. Isn't that a real situation?
So there is a reporting process that's required by state law now 5 years out. So in 2029, we are required to report out on our progress for our housing allocation. And there is the concept of, I'm trying to remember what it's called. It's when you adjust the plan, it's reasonable measures. And what that means is that if you're not meeting, you're not showing progress towards the allocation, and you're not making, actually delivering some of the types that you've tried to add emphasis to in your policies, and that you've opened the door to through code changes, and you've ensured that there's capacity for, that then you would want to look at, well, why? What's happening? And a lot of it has to do with funding and costs of projects. And Sammamish is particularly challenging because we're not next to a transit center. We're not along a light rail line. Another thing to keep in mind with regional planning is that we have made choices about where our investment goes. Right. Most of our monies go towards larger projects regionally, like state highways and freeways and light rail. And, a good example is the SR 520 project and all the funding and expense that's gone into that. So Sammamish hasn't been the recipient of a freeway lid on SR 520 like Hunts Point or Medina has. But I'm saying the difference there is that we don't have access to that. So that presents a challenge because we have to fund it locally, whereas they receive state funding to build that and federal funding, right? And thankfully we don't have one because of the character that it changed. Yeah, I agreed there. I think that the point here is that we're trying to facilitate that type of housing to be built, but there isn't a requirement under the growth target that we only build that type of housing, which I think is where the confusion lies, is that there's a belief that if all of our growth target of 2,100 units is comprised of deeper affordable bands in the housing allocation, that therefore we must only allow that to be built. And it's the complete opposite. We don't control what is built. Instead, we try to add emphasis and prioritize what is built through code and through provision for capacity. And that's what we're doing with this plan. And that's what King County reviews is to make sure is happening. So the challenge is that developers could very well continue to want to build single family homes. But we have the ability to fine tune our development regulations. And we actually did that a couple of years ago with our development regulations updates, where we tried to disincentivize single family homes in order to prioritize the town center being built. There's a balance, right? If it's very easy to build and there's not much regulation around single family homes, developers are going to, and they're lucrative, developers are going to continue to build them. But if they're more restrictive and they're not quite as lucrative, and then the town center becomes more attractive, or middle housing becomes more attractive, or some of the other centers become more attractive, then that's where they'll build. So we're trying to find the balance. On the one hand, we can't take property rights and tell somebody they can't build something, but on the other hand, we want to try to prioritize and add emphasis to certain types of housing, which is what the state and the county is telling us through our housing allocation. Is these are the categories of housing that you need to add emphasis to, but it doesn't require that we build it. It just shows that you have to plan for and accommodate it. And it doesn't say that you can't build any more market housing. It simply is identifying in your housing profile as a community, these are where the deficiencies lie. And these are where you need to add emphasis and open the door so that they could be built, and try to steer the development industry towards them.
Got it. Thank you so much. Thanks, Chair.
Syed, you had a comment?
Yeah, a couple of questions, David. Number one, can we assume that the growth target is infrastructure-based versus the housing allocation is more or less land use capacity-based?
I think a better way to say it is that the growth target,
Kind of simplify what you're saying.
growth target is quantitative and the allocation is qualitative.
So the 2,100 is Which one?
2,100 is the growth target. That's where it all starts, right?
Right.
And the idea there is that is the number by which we're supposed to plan for the delivery of services and infrastructure, regardless of whether those are market housing units or those are 80% AMI units or 30% AMI units. We need to plan for those units and those numbers of people coming to the city.
And I saw somewhere in the report that the capacity, housing capacity in the city is somewhere between 7,000 to 9,000.
So the interesting thing there is when we started down this process, we went through what's called the Urban Growth Capacity Study, and we followed the King County guidance, prescriptive guidance by which to analyze the community for land capacity availability. We completed that work and we identified a number. But immediately after that, we had all these changes that started to occur, and we had HB 1220 that passed that said we had to ensure that there's adequate capacity for these ranges of housing units when we got our allocation. So we have to make some zoning changes that go along with that, and that's what we call the bonus parcels in the plan that we're looking at tonight, where we're adding some capacity on faith-based properties or publicly owned properties to allow and facilitate that to happen. So if somebody wanted to build deeper affordable units on a faith-based property, they could do that, and we're adding that capacity. So that's an increase in capacity beyond what the initial capacity study revealed. Then we also got a lovely present from the legislature in 2023 that required that we plan for middle housing under HB 1110. And HB 1110 again adds capacity to the city because now you're allowed to build 3 units where you're allowed previously 1. So that multiplies the capacity in the neighborhoods significantly. So what ends up happening is we started with our urban growth capacity study under the prescriptive process given to us by King County. We went through that. They endorsed that. It was published as part of the King County countywide planning policies. It's still in there. It shows what Sammamish's capacity is. And then these things happened, and our capacity went up again and went up again. But the guidance that we've received from Puget Sound Regional Council and from the King County Growth Management Planning Council is that we don't redo our growth capacity study. Instead, we do capacity studies to make sure that our middle housing, that we have capacity to accept middle housing, that we're changing our zoning regulations to accommodate as state law requires, but also that we're providing capacity for our housing allocation under HB 1220. So we have to show our work, and we've done that in the plan, and we've provided that to King County, and they're currently in review of it. So what we do is we show that we have enough land zoned in an appropriate manner for the purpose of delivery of the of the housing allocation types. Should a developer or a not-for-profit or funding come from the state to build it, it's available, and there's a process and not a barrier to it being built.
So you're saying that we have looked at based on the capacity, we can go all the way up to between 7,000 to 9,000 dwelling units? Yes? No?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is certainly we could exceed the 2,100. There's no cap on development.
And why are we showing there's a capacity between 7,000 to 9,000 in the report?
It's just it's a math exercise. It's a simple.
Is with the assumption that we have enough infrastructure to support that kind of capacity?
It doesn't take into account infrastructure. It's just simply a math exercise based on the model that was developed by the region. So
those numbers are not really real that we can count on and say,
right.
Okay,
and I think
we can go beyond the allocation level.
Yeah, to David's point, and there are cities that have theoretically capacity much higher than Sammamish does relative to its growth target. But I think one of the opportunities in the next update or even before that time is to develop an updated approach to it that looks more closely at capacity relative to all these laws that were passed, midstream, because the urban growth capacity study did not account for middle housing.
So in other words, at this point, we don't have the actual capacity number, real capacity number of number of houses.
Yeah.
Let's just,
Yeah.
tell me if I'm wrong, but the capacity can and will change all the time. So we should be careful about saying,
Based
what
on
is our,
land use assumptions.
yeah, I mean, we could change it if we want to. The legislature changed it on our behalf. I mean,
Yeah.
we should be careful about saying that we have this capacity,
And there's-
because tomorrow it might be something different.
And there are huge assumptions that go into it, like a market factor where you just take 30% of the land out of the equation. I mean, there are some major assumptions that are applied across the entire region that, may or may not bear to be true. But it's a very somewhat sophisticated structure that the state's been planning under for a while, and it's continues to be challenging, but also has some benefits by forcing cities to go through the process to have a better understanding of it. I think it's really a planning tool.
Can I just ask a clarifying question to see if my understanding, or maybe this helps me understand it, if I'm right? So to me, it seems that the comp plan kind of does two things which are not necessarily well coordinated. One is it demonstrates legislative compliance with the rules and limits that have been set for the community. And we could stop right there and we could check the box and we'd be done. But we've also chosen as a separate objective to do some planning for what the community would look like and what the community wants. So those two things don't always mesh well, although I think this plan does a pretty good job of it. But let me just ask, if that's correct, does any of that preclude us from choosing to do something different later? In other words, we have to demonstrate compliance, and that's a checkbox. And then if we want to decide to change the number of housing units in town center or develop a neighborhood center and put some housing there that was never anticipated in the comp plan, that is still fully within our control to do that. And we don't have to demonstrate legislative compliance necessarily, as long as we're staying within the rules, until the next time we have to do a comp plan update or a check-in or whatever it is, right? So I guess in my mind, what I think about this is people get confused between what the community sort of in-house voice, in the family discussion is, and the obligation to comply legislatively with the things that have been given to us that we have no choice about.
Yeah, you stated that correctly, and I think one of our challenges working with a number of cities is how to take these mandates and apply them in the right way to the communities. And actually, ironically, you bring that up, but David and I are going to be speaking at the planning conference in the fall about leveraging state mandates to meet community goals and really just talking about that exact issue. I feel like we've done a good job through this plan to do that, but you're absolutely right. There are a number of things like neighborhood centers and housing and parks and all these topics that will continue to be refined over the planning period. And you're absolutely right. We would expect that there will be further changes to zoning and code and updates to the plan to make additional steps towards implementing this. So, and that includes expanding housing choice for sure, which is something we've heard throughout the process from the community.
I think that's it for now.
Okay.
What's next?
We just have a few more slides. So we're just going to go through just briefly a little bit on engagement and a little summary of what's in each element. So public engagement required through to update your comprehensive plan. We had to develop a public engagement plan early on in the process. We had a planning summit event back in the fall of 2022. That was a multi-day event on certain topics. We had pretty good attendance and a lot of feedback at that. There was the block party event, which you see some of the photos from up there. That was connected to a community event and an opportunity to have input. We've maintained a project website. We've had many meetings with the Planning Commission and the City Council to review concepts and get input. We've done focus groups, outreach at the farmers market, and of course, fielding questions and taking comments at those meetings. Some of the themes that we heard, a strong desire from many for the town center and the centers to develop to include more amenities, to be more walkable. Definitely still some concerns around, density and growth. Tree removal continues to be a concern. A lot of emphasis on more housing options. One of the things we looked at early on was sort of looking at household sizes and house sizes or home sizes, and there's a huge mismatch, indicating a desire, a need for more smaller units. So folks that maybe have a larger home and looking to downsize or vice versa, creating those options for folks to maintain their roots in Sammamish is really important. Strong emphasis, of course, on the environment, and now with the city's first climate action plan and climate element is a really exciting addition to this 2024 comp plan. And then finally, just, parks and trails continue to remain a real asset in the community. While there is a desirable to be a more walkable city in the sense of being able to access goods and services and neighborhood centers, it's recognized that Sammamish is very walkable with respect to like trails and recreation and access to parks. And that's definitely something that the community wants to maintain and continue to see grow over time. So the land use element, we covered a lot of the technical parts in a previous slide, but the land use element is really the foundation of the plan. The map in the middle there is called the future land use map, and that's probably the most important graphic in the entire plan. It really sets the stage for what can happen under zoning and the long-term planning efforts of the city. So a couple of highlights. The town center continues to remain a focus, and we're in process of looking at updating the town center plan and code as well to align with the comp plan. So for those interested, encourage you to pay attention to that. The areas in hatched on the map are two of the centers, Inglewood and Pine Lake. And we've been talking about doing some sub-area planning for those areas, which was something that was emphasized through some of the community engagement. So anticipate planning for that in the next year or two. We've introduced the concept of neighborhood centers. They're identified in these little pins here. These are prospective locations, but there will be an effort, I believe, potentially next year to better define how those neighborhood centers would get formally established, whether it's through a city process, application from a developer, property owner, community group, and what that zoning and sort of policy framework would look like to implement that. So that has potential to be really exciting, and I think something that's definitely desired for many community members. And I think that's the highlight. The other, I guess, thing I'll just mention, the area that you see in the yellowish color, which is most of the land area of the city, those are the single-family zones, and those are the ones that are subject to House Bill 1110, which is the middle housing bill. So those properties will have allowances for some measure of middle housing as well as accessory dwelling units. And then these are just some photo examples to show some of the scale and intensity of development anticipated in some of these locations. So neighborhood residential, is really looking at kind of the middle housing types, everything from single family, townhouses, duplexes, and similar types of development. The town center and the mixed-use centers are kind of envisioned for a mix of housing types, but up to mid-rise, but also things like townhouses and smaller-scale residential. Neighborhood center, again, anticipated to be pretty small scale, could include some, potentially some housing, but I think would be focused more on services and amenities within proximity to neighborhoods. And then finally, just examples of some parks and open space designations there, which are mostly the city parks. So the housing element also really critical for this update because of all of the stuff we just described earlier. So on the upper left there where it says housing need, that's the housing allocation broken down by unit types. And most of Sammamish's allocation is below 80%, and even, I guess, the majority below 50%. There's also 401 units of emergency housing we need to accommodate, which is separate, and something we'll talk a little bit about in the next topic, or the last topic on the agenda tonight, which is going over the code updates. So we will be looking to adopt this plan at the end of the year along with the code updates. The city does have the opportunity to take another 6 months, but I think we're ahead of the game, which is great, and it allows us to kind of consider this all as one package. So city should be in really good shape starting next year with all of that in place. Transportation, this is an update to Volume 1. Which is the transportation element. There's also Volume 2, which is going to be the transportation master plan. And we will be, this element will be evolving a bit. And it's an opportunity to consolidate all of the transportation plans in one place, anticipating another update to the TMP next year, which would include a multimodal plan and refinements for reductions in vehicle miles traveled, which is a key goal of the Climate Action Plan. So Sammamish, has, I think, a world-class parks system, and as I said earlier, continues to be a high priority for the community. The city did update its PROS plan, its Parks, Recreation, and Open Space plan recently, so a lot of the work that we've been doing with the element is really incorporating a lot of that good work that was already completed and adopted by the city. There are some connections to the climate change element as well, and sort of preserving natural features and resources, many of those which exist in the park system. It's likely that this would result eventually in an update to the park impact fees to reflect the updated park project list. Another goal is to improve not only the potential amount of parkland, but access to parkland, and looking at opportunities to have parks in proximity to neighborhood center locations is something we're also planning to look at. The city is adopting or will be adopting as part of this effort, its first economic development element, which is another exciting opportunity. This is really a policy document and meant to really be a first step towards economic development. I think there's more work to be done to hone in on a strategy and build momentum towards implementation. Economic development can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different communities. Redmond was mentioned earlier. There's twice as many people work in Redmond as live in Redmond. That's not going to be Sammamish. Sammamish is going to do something that really fits in with the context of the community. For those of you that are interested, I did notice that Redmond has just recently adopted an economic development strategic plan. And it might, for those of you that are interested, might want to take a look at that just to see an example of something that a nearby community did recently. So some of the themes around economic development, workforce housing. There's 6,000 people that travel to Sammamish to work, 30,000 people that leave. So looking for opportunities for people to work and live in Sammamish, as well as improving transit connections. The sub-area planning for the centers is another, I think, opportunity around economic development to really define what the community would like that to look like, needed infrastructure and desired amenities and housing, the neighborhood centers. This is also highly related to the issue of fiscal sustainability, and that map in the middle, the taller red areas indicate areas of higher economic productivity measured as land value per acre. And those indicate basically properties that generate a lot of tax revenue and ability to help fund services. The areas that are flatter tend to have lower productivity. And then also some connections to the climate change element and things like walkability, biking connections, proximity of neighborhoods to services. The capital facilities and utilities element is really where you combine all of the project lists that are required to accommodate development in the land use plan come together. So transportation, parks, utilities, all are listed here and identified. We're required to provide a 6-year project list in order to achieve or maintain our level of service. Our level of service is a metric that is a local policy decision that identifies our desired sort of future around a specific facility. Probably the easiest example would be the local parks. Apologize, it's a little hard to see, but it says 9.9 acres of parkland per 1,000 residents, and you can use that to do the math and figure out what the needs are based on the anticipated population growth. Others are more qualitative in nature and require a little bit more critical thinking in terms of identifying projects needed. So 6-year capital plan is required. We have to be able to fund it. We can have a 20-year list, and it can be more general. It doesn't have to have the same emphasis on funding. We're really looking at the programmatic aspect of this and how this can be routinely maintained and updated annually to maintain that consistency with the comprehensive plan. Goals and objectives, and then I should have mentioned this first, but a real focus on practicality. We want to develop a plan that's achievable. Sometimes cities get in trouble because they, have lofty goals, which can sound good, but if you can't reasonably achieve it, it can be challenging. Another new element, the city adopted a climate action plan recently, and kind of like the parks element, this is a distillation of that document. And this is a new required element, and again, one that City of Sammamish is ahead of the curve on. You can see over on the left-hand side some of the goals. I mentioned earlier vehicle miles traveled reduction, goal of 30% by 2030, 50% by 2050. Greenhouse gas emission reductions, 50% by 2030 and 96% reduction by 2050. Another kind of just interesting thing that you can look at online if you're interested, we showed this to the council the other day, but the map in the middle is a piece of a research that was done, I believe, by folks through University of California at Berkeley. But the mapping tool was hosted on the New York Times, and it's basically mapping climate impacts per capita. And so the green areas indicate areas of lower per capita climate impacts. The darker areas indicate higher. You can see Sammamish is in the darker color. There's a variety of factors that play into this. One is sort of density and proximity and walkability. Wealth also factors into it, and just kind of general land use patterns as well. So those are just some of the factors, and I think there's interesting kind of relationship between this map and the land value per acre map. Again, just sort of high level, there seems to be some correlation between those two and the areas that are sort of higher productivity and the ones that have less climate impacts. And you can, search anywhere in the U.S. It's pretty interesting even to look at places like New York City, which very different than Sammamish and not something we're of course aspiring to, but even in those environments with higher wealth and you still tend to see a lot more green than you do in some of the other areas. So just a little piece of interesting information there. And that is the conclusion of the presentation. Be happy to answer any questions you may have on any of the other elements.
Thanks, Jeff and David. Who has questions before we open the public hearing? John? No, I can't see your light, John. Go ahead.
So I want to go back to housing, but tie it together with some other elements of the comp plan, because this whole document and planning effort, huge balancing act between almost competing chapters, elements. The analogy I'd use is, neighborhoods want traffic to go slower, so the traffic department puts in narrower streets and speed bumps, but then the fire engines and police officers want to get there faster. So how do you reconcile that? the city has to do that because there's this absolute service expectation that we will. And the comp plan is the key document to all of those operations. You know, there's no doubt that the region needs more housing. And the market is not in sync with the overall needs. I was glad Jeff and David tied the growth targets to capacity services and things like concurrency. I was on the Fiscal Sustainability Committee, and capacity services to keep that high quality that our residents desire requires budget, and we have a budget forecast shortfall. So again, all of this has to stay somewhat in balance. So creating the tools where a developer or an individual would like to do some middle housing, great, or low income, developer agreements to incentivize that. We've got the bonus parcels, the whole housing toolkit. And then key to this whole thing, I think, going forward is a future land use map, as you've mentioned. We're not capped at the target, but we have to keep in mind how much capacity we have in parks, transportation, other city services. And a lot of our services, the city doesn't deliver. Utilities. There was a crisis here a couple of years ago with sewer on the north end of the plateau. A growth boom could create another crisis like that that's out of the hands of the city. So I think compliment staff and consultant and my fellow commission members have done a good job of trying to reach that balance and provide the tools that we need to move forward without putting restrictions on opportunities that might come along. You know, maybe the city wants to float a housing bond. There's no restriction on doing that. So, good work. Thank you.
Who else? And I'll remind you guys, I can't see your light, so raise your hand or give me a wink or something. Ajay, you got something?
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. That was really good. From what I understand, the whole reason I came with that question was because if you just use game theory and game this out, we would have achieved everything except missing middle or the goals that you mentioned, right? That is a real possibility that we are walking towards. We could have excellent numbers on vehicle miles traveled. There could be Amazon and Microsoft sending buses down here, and people will use those buses and go there and come back, and we could say we reduced car usage so much. We reduced the global gas mileage, the overall mileage so much, and we got a number of great factors associated with it. People with the younger population would like more housing. That'll make it available for them in that case. But behind all that, we will miss a point where there'll be families and people here who would say, this is not the city I saw earlier when I was moving into this place. And this is the city which has become very crowded. This is the city which has become more concrete. And my views and my neighborhoods are not there as I wanted it to be. We really having that, we could run into that risk. The positive that I took were 2 points. One is that we don't have to compare ourselves as we report back to the state for all of those things with other cities which may be the same as we are right now, number one. Number two is that we have another lever, the 2100. It could be something more. We could work that up as we are doing it, help achieve that missing middle. If we follow those two things, that would really solve that other problem as well. Otherwise, this is a fantastic document, like Commissioner John said. I think that's great. Kudos to the members here. Just take that as a small grain of salt out of a nerdy exercise.
Syed, did you have something?
Couple of, I'm going to send an email to the staff and the consultant on a specific editorial and maybe some questions, but a couple of the one that I want to kind of bring it up for the discussion. One is that, David, the report makes reference to the plausible parcel, bonus parcel. Are those parcels available for residential use or commercial? Are there some restrictions? And what is the definition of plausible?
The bonus parcels specifically?
Bonus parcel
Yeah, so
and the plausible.
the state within the last few years passed a law that specifically allows cities to authorize a density bonus, that's where the word bonus comes from, on parcels owned by religious organizations. And Bellevue's been working under that program that they adopted locally into their code for a while. Other cities have as well. We've taken that concept and added publicly owned properties to the same program. So those properties could be really in any zoning district. We have some identified on a map, but as ownership changes, those could shift around. But the density bonus is specifically just for affordable housing. So it'd have to be perpetually affordable housing, I think below 80% is what we're looking at, yeah.
So in other words, the bonus parcels would be only for residential use?
Well, not entirely. The bonus part is residential, but, and we're going to talk about this later, but like an affordable housing project could include a daycare and other services associated with it. But if it's a residential zone, you couldn't probably put a store there or something.
Absolutely. So everything Jeff said, and it's typically, so think about the bundle of things that a church might include. And say, for example, that a church had some outbuildings that were being utilized for a daycare, and maybe there was a youth group or some other Sunday school type stuff, or academic purposes or whatever they were using them for. They could, in theory, demolish those outbuildings, build a larger building that included some affordable housing units in it, and retain the ground floor for the purpose of their daycare and what other things they were doing, and maybe also add some community outreach space where maybe a social services provider could move in and help any people in the building that might need some assistance, right? So that is actually a model that we're seeing in the planning profession around the country being used. And just recently, we've been approached by the Sammamish Presbyterian Church. They're very interested in something like that. So we're starting to work with them to understand how these rules might apply to that property, and working with some other housing and service providers to understand that relationship there.
So let's say, in case of churches, can we give some bonuses, some privileges, some advantages to build affordable housing?
That's exactly what we're doing with the bonus parcels, right? So most churches have pretty big parking lots and have some underutilized lands, and they also have a mission objective, right? So and we've been seeing that there are certain changes being made to ownership patterns in churches, and they are coming up with some surplus lands. So we are seeing this as a pattern that's emerging in the region and nationally.
The other question that I have is that I just noticed that the town center boundary doesn't include the library. Is that a reason for it? The map that you have, it doesn't go beyond that.
I think I'd have to look at the map, so I can't answer that now. But that's not a change that we're making. If it doesn't, it would go back to the point where the plan was adopted, and I can't speak to why or why not if that's the case.
But the boundary of the town center is pretty much fixed, cannot be changed.
The boundary of the town center is fixed. It could be changed through the town center amendment process or some other town center planning process, but it would take quite a bit of analysis, community outreach, environmental review, all those things, and that is not proposed and not achievable as part of the comprehensive plan update process that's in front of us.
And the last question had to do with the floor area ratio for the ADUs. They don't apply floor area restrictions? Is that exempt?
Mainly because we have to allow them at a minimum up to 1,000 square feet. The provision that we wrote to not count them was actually something we did in the phase 2 updates, and something that we're working through in the code updates. But because we have to allow them, we couldn't say, oh, you're over on the FAR, you can't build an ADU. So we have to treat that one a little bit differently. But the other units will have those caps.
So recall that in addition to HB 1110, which is the middle housing bill, there is another ADU bill that requires that if somebody wanted to build ADUs on their property, so say they have a home, that they be allowed 2 ADUs on their property up to 1,000 square feet. Yep. So it's not so much an FAR issue because the state law says 1,000 square feet. It doesn't say, 0.2 FAR for an ADU. It really calls out specifically 1,000 square feet. That's why the FAR restriction really isn't applicable to ADUs.
Thank you.
Yep. Good question.
Okay. Anybody else with questions before we open the public hearing? Mike?
There was a conversation a while ago about the land use portion and the minimum lot size that can be subdivided more. And I remember it was 6,000 square feet. So has there been any further thoughts about that, or is that locked? That if I have an acre and you have 6, we're treated similarly?
Yeah, so great question. So we'll be talking about the zoning. There's 2 parts to the comp plan update. There's the comp plan itself, which includes volume 1 and volume 2. Volume 1 is the lofty policy stuff and the vision stuff. Volume 2 is the technical background information, kind of our show our work kind of thing. And then that's the first part to the comp plan update process, the comp plan itself. Then there's the second part, which is the enabling regulations. And the bundle of regulations that go along with it. So we're going to be talking as the third agenda item this evening about the enabling regulations. But to quickly answer your question, there are multiple things that go into whether you could divide a property. We had contemplated using a minimum lot size, but we determined that there are other zoning controls that are more appropriate, that are more dynamic related to this circumstance. The first of which I think is the most controlling, which is a density calculation. Yeah. So if you're in the R4, you're at 4 units per acre. Well, you have to have the square footage to achieve 4 using the density calculation. So that's really the first step. Then you get into all sorts of other things like, impervious surface and lot coverage and tree retention and stormwater and all the things that go into that.
And the last thing I'll just say is the only way you could get below the standard lot size, like a 1/4 acre, is if you're preserving open space or providing some other benefit. And we have a number of criteria that we wrote as part of phase 2 to do that, whereas before you could just do it if you wanted to do it. So the reality is that for any small scale, they're going to have to default probably to the standard lot size, which in most of the area would be around 10,000 square feet. And anything less would be a trade-off for protecting trees or having a playground or something that was a public benefit. Folks wouldn't be able to just create any lot size that they want to add more units. So we'll cover that.
I want to highlight that although we're having a public hearing tonight on the comp plan component of this, that our work on the enabling development regulations will continue into August and possibly into September. We want to get it right. And we'd be happy to work with any one of you individually if you wanted to talk through the development regulations and make sure that we're aware of what we are requiring and whether remember to think about development regulations along the terms of what is the tool that we're using to regulate and then what is the setting, right? So, if it's the floor to area ratio as a tool, well, what is it? 0.5, 0.65, and what does that do, right? So thinking about those 2 things. Is it the right tool and is it the right setting?
Yep, thank you.
Mike, you had something?
2 things. One is just a thank you. I don't know if public would know this or not. I guess if they looked and asked for, documents. But several of us sent emails to the staff with specific questions about the latest update. And the turnaround was fantastic. So big thank you for that. It saved having to ask a lot more questions this evening. But the second one, back to the housing, the 2,100, and this will be quick, but I think a clarification would help me and maybe others. That's the target, as you said, that we're planning for the infrastructure. And, as John mentioned, how everything fits together. We're not building those. Developers build those based on the code and market conditions, all of that. It's possible over the course of the next several years that we see more or less development on track to, and I'm going to say, exceed that 2,100. If that's happening, then we would potentially not have the infrastructure to really match the potential growth. And if that's the case, and here's really the question, we have the capital plan for the 6 years, and from time to time we take a look and update things. And at that time we would say, oh, we need more whatever, the infrastructure to handle that growth. And so that's how things would play out. The converse is there's nothing that we would do other than the code that we have in place that would say we've got to stop and cap development at that 2,100. So that's my understanding of how this would all play out over the next several years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, even if we went over the 2,100, you wouldn't necessarily make the assumption that the infrastructure wasn't there. You'd have to go and look at it and look at the nature of it. The other thing is that, we're in the midst of updating the town center plan, which has a number of infrastructure-related issues associated with it, new roads and public amenities and things like that. So that's one opportunity. And then the sub-area planning process can look at more like scenario planning, which again, doesn't mean you're planning for it in the comp plan, but you can do scenario planning, look at environmental impacts under SEPA and things like that to be able to get a sense of that. So the neighborhood center planning also is an opportunity to do that. So you're absolutely right. There is a process for dealing with that should that come up.
And everything Jeff said, plus we have a development permit process that takes into account capacity, right? So if you're proposing a development that requires permit, that you then have to go through first traffic concurrency to determine if there's adequate transportation infrastructure. And we have a model that we run it through and we grant traffic concurrency. You have to go to the water and sewer district to get water and sewer availability certificates. And they have a model that they run based on development patterns and what they're seeing and capacity. You have to go through the school district to determine whether or not, and we have a process that we do with the school district to determine if there is school capacity. And I want to make sure to stress for anybody listening at this point, maybe a few years from now, that school capacity is not judged based on the neighborhood school capacity. It's school capacity across the entire school district. And there's a lot of state law about that and nothing we can do about that. And we've been around that one a few times here at the city, but I want to make sure people understand that. So just my point is that as we review development applications, as we get pre-applications in, we report our engagement with this community or with the development community to all of the service providers. We report that out to the school districts, so obviously the transportation department, they're here at the city, to the water and sewer district, and we make sure that they're aware of trends and activity, and they're able to then adjust their forecasting. And there comes a time when something doesn't pass the concurrency test, when something doesn't get a water and sewer certificate, when something identifies that, hey, across the district, the school district, they're not able to provide adequate classroom space. And that is when development is paused, and under the concurrency system, they could either then themselves fund an improvement to bring it up to concurrency, or they could wait until the public infrastructure catches up. So that is how that system works.
Well, it's helpful, I think, to set all of this into that more dynamic context than a number that's sitting in the comp plan. And the comp plan's helpful for our overall planning purposes, but then there's the dynamics that will go on just as you described. So that certainly helps me understand the process that would go on. Thank you.
I always think of it that we're painting the lines on the field, but we don't know what teams are going to show up, what game they're going to want to play, what time they're going to go home. We really don't know. We're just setting the stage.
But we do have some rules for the games,
Yeah.
right? So, well, can I
Go ahead, Sue.
Thank you, Jeff, for the great presentation, and I've learned a lot. Thank you, David, for the differentiation between the growth target and housing allocation. I think I understood. So I do have two simple questions. In one of the maps, I saw the neighborhood center near Pine Lake. I want to see which area that is.
The Pine Lake was referring to
It's on your slide deck.
Sorry. Pine Lake was referring to the shopping center area mostly, and that's identified as a mixed-use center, which is a higher category than the neighborhood center.
There's also a neighborhood center to the west of there. There's a pin on the map.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's a general location. I believe that to be the intersection. I don't know the streets, but the fire station and the baseball facility that's there.
There's a community center there.
Yeah, community center, like its old fire station. That could be the location of a potential future neighborhood center. All of those sub areas and neighborhood centers that were on the map require sub area planning.
Okay.
So we want to be really clear that those items in the pins and those items in the hatched polygons, whether it's the Klahani to the southeast, the Pine Lake right to the center on the south, or the Inglewood above the red area, or the, I want to say 4 or 5 pins, I think it's 4 pins on the map, are areas that were identified through our planning process as potential future sub areas in two forms: neighborhood center or full-blown sub area. And any one of those could be activated by the property owner request, the city wanting to do it on our own because we think it's a great idea to add services to that area in the city, or it could be done by broader community interest, which prompts the city to do it.
Gotcha.
It's important to add a distinction to the different scales of those. The neighborhood centers are more akin to like local services. If you think about a 4-way intersection, maybe there's storefronts on all 4 corners, apartments right over that, 2 or 3 stories. Fairly low intensity, right? But a place where people could go to have a coffee shop, or maybe a daycare could be in one of those buildings. Or you might, recently where I live, there's a mini mart that was converted to a really wonderful local eatery that everyone's going to now, and it's a great place. It's walkable. It's trying to create some walkable destinations in those parts of the city. The other is the sub areas, which is a much bigger planning process, and these areas are really actually exciting because these are large areas of impervious surface that are generally underutilized for the purpose of buildings and development. And that presents a lot of opportunity to redevelop where you're not adding impervious surface, and you actually could add stormwater improvements to really improve the amount of stormwater and the quality of water coming off of those properties with minimal impact. But we have to also do a corridor study to make sure that there's the right amount of transit. We already have too much of a reliance on 228th. We want to make sure we're understanding the relationships between everything going on 228th. And we really want to look at how to connect ourselves to our external partners and neighbors. Maybe there's a way over time, and I'm just speculating here. This is not actually anything that's being proposed, but if you could, as a visionary plan, if you could imagine some form of a rapid ride bus service between Marymore and Issaquah Highlands, or Marymore and downtown Issaquah, maybe there's a line A, line B, line C that runs between those 3 every 5 minutes. And you could go out to a bus stop along one of those lines with an app and see when the bus is coming. That might be actually something that becomes meaningful.
Yeah. Thank you, David. I do have one more question, Jeff. So, a couple of slides down. Oh, one back. There's one slide that has the emergency housing, and it said it's not included in the target. Can you explain what emergency housing meant?
Yeah, so it would be... Sorry. So we're going to cover this in the last topic in more detail, but generally there's emergency shelter, which is, more of an immediate thing. Then emergency housing, again, it's usually transitioning perhaps from homelessness or some sort of short-term effort as a kind of a bridge to get to long-term housing. So that's what that is. And there's just some specific things we have to accommodate in our code. It's mainly code changes to facilitate that.
And the target is 401 houses for that?
No, it would be more like beds or
Oh, okay.
bedrooms, yeah.
There are also some recently passed limitations on what you can require that goes along with that. So you can't, for example, say that you're planning that and you're going to those units and you're going to allow them, but you're also going to require that there be, trying to think of the right way to say this, 24-hour services on site, or that there be social services nearby or within the vicinity. There are limitations on what you can require that goes along with that. So we have to be able to accommodate that and show that we have the zoning that allows it. I think that Jeff might kick me here when I say this, but the easiest way to think about it is hotel space. If you have enough space, enough zoning to accommodate that many beds in hotel space, and you have a permit process that allows it readily, easily to be built, then you're generally, there's some other nuances there, but generally compliant with that.
Yeah. The idea being that some older motels and stuff have been purchased and used for that purpose, but not something we have.
We don't
locally
have
in
any
Sammamish,
hotels
so-
in here. Well, thank you.
Yep.
So let me just wrap this up before we go to the public hearing by expressing my gratitude to you, Jeff, and your team for the work that's gone into this, and to David and Evan and all the city staff that have worked on this. We're not quite done talking about it, but considering the lift involved in the legislative requirements and the, various things that people wanted to see in this plan, I feel very good about where we've gotten to so far, and that's because of all the hard work of the people that have been working behind the scenes. So I think I can speak on behalf of the commission in saying thank you for how you've gotten us here to this point, tolerated our questions, and been patient with us as we work our way through this, so thanks. Okay, let's do the public hearing. So I'll just remind everybody, 7 minutes per person. This is a public hearing about the Planning Commission recommending the comp plan as currently included in the packet, let's say, to the City Council. Who would like to make public comment? I'm going to tap my gavel here. Who would like to make public comment for the public hearing on this topic? I'm going to just start calling on you guys if you... Mary's going first.
Goes right on you. Mary Wichter, Sammamish, 24 years. First, there's a ton of work that went in and the format and the information, and it's really great in the document. I'm going to speak to just a couple things here. Being the geohazard person, I went into the comp plan and just searched for steep slopes, and then I searched for a critical area. There's like a whole bunch of steep slopes that I'm glad for, and then critical areas, I think there's 99 of them. And then I noticed as I was clicking through and going, there's an inconsistency between the comp plan language and the critical areas ordinance language. So in some places you say just critical areas, and then in some places you name them like wetlands and the other things. And then in one place you actually say that, and you say it's the state definition, which is good because then you don't have to do the other ones. And then it kind of goes along. And I'm glad that steep slopes are called out, but they actually are a landslide hazard and regulated as such. But I'd like to keep those called out because with the critical areas ordinance, you're actually going to hear me ask that when people give their critical area report that they just map slopes, because we have that 2-foot contour. And then if you're putting water into a slope that's 15%, you're creating a landslide hazard. So I just would like, so I guess if anyone with a pen out there, one of your amendments could be, if you pass it, that you would like there to be a review on the consistency used between critical areas in the comp plan and the critical areas code. And then that way I don't have to go through a whole bunch of detailed stuff right now because it's 500 pages in the packet. So anyway, really good work, and I'm glad for that. And I'm glad that, that you presented everything well. I did want to talk a little bit on housing. I go to a lot of the water district meetings since 2015, as well as the meetings here, because there have been problems, and I listen there and here. So first of all, the water districts, there's 2 of them. There's one up by Sahali, that's the northeast, and then there's Sammamish Plateau Water, which does 2/3 of the city or 3/4, and then also King County outside. There is no problem with water. Like 85% of our groundwater comes from really deep wells. We're not even relying on snowpack. In most places in this city, you can't actually drill a well anymore because you have to go through, is it legally available and physically available? And it's like really nasty. So you get on the water services. And our water is so clean in the Northeast, they don't even chlorinate the water. And then they've had some water quality issues in Sammamish Plateau water also, including Issaquah. So you do have water, and you don't need to worry about how much there is or what you're doing with it. What you don't want to do is make it dirty, because you can't afford to clean it up when you do so. Also for the sewer, they did the wastewater comp plan for Sammamish Plateau water in 2022, and then it got passed and reviewed in 2023. The numbers that I saw at several meetings that may or may not have changed or will change are they have about 13,000 units that you can have. So any of the numbers that you've seen or heard from people, they're not up to the 13,000, so sewer will not be limiting. And then what I wanted to talk about is a little bit on housing. I believe, great comments, by the way, from everyone who spoke. And for John, I always get Boffman and Backman messed up when I say it. So John Backman, he talked about, if you've noticed, we're kind of having a fiscal sustainability problem. So let me try to, I didn't do a diagram, I didn't email anything in, but let me just try to do something. So if this is a house and it's worth $750,000, and this is a house and it's worth $750,000, and there's 4 of them, you end up like $3 million if you add those together. So if you stack those units in town center, 700, and you know that there's not a lot of $750,000 houses in the city, so those are more affordable. And I think even the Habitat for Humanity houses are King County valued at that. So if you do 4 of them, you get on 1 square foot of land, you tax 4 houses for $3 million. Okay, versus if you have 1 single family home on that square of land, and it's even if it's a $2.5 million home, you're going to get more tax money out of the dense stacked units. And then also for sustainability, if you have stacked flats or mid-rise or something or other, your building doesn't emit as many emissions. And then you have more common walls. When you also go higher and taller, you're using less impervious area and footprint. And then for transit, more people live together, so they shop together, they work together, they walk to work. If it's on the schools corridor, which most of town center is very close to, because all the schools are pretty much located where land was donated a long time ago to have schools there. That's why we have schools along 228. So many things work. You want it in town center. You don't want it sprawling. So you're supposed to grow wherever there is stuff. So in infill areas like where I live in Tamarack and Inglewood, which are older areas, you are supposed to grow in there, but they're critical areas. And the problem is when you grow there and you don't have the services of sewer or water or some of the other things, you end up hurting yourself. So you don't want to grow in those areas. You want to grow in the town center area and the other centers. In town center, that whole, my husband calls it Desolation Boulevard with the 5 roundabouts and really no houses along it. I can't remember how much that cost, that Southeast 4th Street, but I know like there was a huge grant. I think they were going to lose $5 million if they didn't build it because you had to use the transportation money for growth. And I don't know what the whole thing costs, but we as a city have paid for that. And I know in the water district, when one of the places in there right next to it built, they were only going to put in an 8-inch pipe, and the water district has policies that says, well, if we know it needs to be a 12-inch pipe, you pay for the 8-inch, we'll pay for the upsizing to make sure that we have the 12-inch for when we need it, so we don't have to go back and rip up the street again and like really make it hassling. So that's all that good utility planning and everything. But I think the biggest mistake we can make is to make town center too small. If you make it too small, they're going to build single family homes. You're not going to get the stacked units. You're not going to get the variety. you're not going to have the infrastructure that you need, your transit isn't going to work, your climate change is at risk. So I really, really, you've seen some things from Paul Stickney and from Don Jaron that I agreed with. I believe we really can build 7,000 to 9,000 houses and have it work. And it needs to be done now so we don't lose the older people that have lived here and have no place to go to and don't have a flat entry or a stacked flat or a condo they can go to, who want services. I speak with people all the time that are older and they're like, I've looked, and other than Providence Point, which is in Issaquah, there is no place for me to go to. If I can't do the stairs in my house, I can't go to anything because I have 3 floors. So those are the things I'm talking about. Please increase the housing numbers now. You can do it.
Thanks, Mary. Who's next? Michael?
Michael Mattis, 18 years here in Sammamish. I started this this day a few time zones away, so please forgive any lack of precision here. In trying to wade through the 500-page agenda packet for this meeting, it appears that nowhere in the proposed plans or recommendations are there any defined restraints on developers creating housing density up to as much as 32 units per acre directly adjacent to bordering residences with as little as 1 per acre. 32, if it's R8, 8 becomes 16, 16 becomes 32 under the new state regulatory rules. It is true that the Planning Commission has pulled back from the original idea of an urban residential designation for the Southeast Fourth Corridor, which is of particular interest to Kathy and I. And has eliminated the specter of a 6-story apartment building looming over our house. That's a good thing, and we appreciate that decision. It would be reassuring if there were language here, however, that encourages appropriately scaled transitions between low and then exponentially denser use properties, so that, for example, R1 doesn't immediately abut a wall of 32 homes just a few feet away, which is definitely a possibility. Developers are already working on that, and they called me again last week. I do not know what tools exactly the city, given the new state regulatory regime, has at its disposal to affect such a policy in its comp plan or development regs. And I don't know which subsection or clause or code or element to point to for memorializing such a concept in the comp plan update. Again, 500 pages. It was hard to, put an X on the exact place to go. However, I do encourage the Planning Commission and Community Development Department to pause here and take the time to address this concern in a reasonable and creative way. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I think you're next, Paul.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Paul Stickney, Sammamish. Got a couple things to talk about. I didn't come with any prepared things tonight. I've sent a lot in, yes, but I am here to comment on what was talked about and what's been sent in. First, one correction when I forgot during my agenda comment, I had something off a little bit, and I prefer to be accurate if I can. Redmond's got 48 affordable houses per 1,000 as of 2020. I think I said 44, so that's just a change. Next, in a comment I sent you, one statement I made is it's not who's right, it's what's right. I believe what I'm going to tell you is what's right, but if it isn't, I'd love to be corrected. But regardless, I think this comp plan needs to have some language that's clear on a couple of these issues. And I'm going to also work into it a sort of a matrix chart with a check mark or an X in just a sec. But first, I'd like to take a step back, and I saw an article today about Southwest Airlines. They said it took them 50 years to change a policy to, instead of having people be stressed to the max and worried about getting on in groups, they're going to assign seats. What I want to talk about is we've had a 25-year lack of policy to truly understand how housing supplies meet internal needs over lifetime and legacy, and this plan does not achieve that. So having said that, I'm going to launch into the rest of my comment. During the growth target process from 2020 to 2021, affordable housing in Sammamish was not addressed, was not brought up. The 1,300 target our cities had for 20 years before that time was not even talked about. But it's been planned in the comp plan, so it gets a check. But in the growth target process, it gets an X. It was not talked about. Missing middle housing. It was underway but not passed. It was coming. You saw the freight train coming in 2019 and 20. Was it discussed by the city powers that be that, hey, maybe we should consider that coming and make that a factor in our target? No. So in the growth target, it was a X. In the comp plan, great. It was checked. Internal housing needs. One time in Sammamish. In the first comprehensive plan, in the land use element and housing element, the city quantified, they don't show the work, but they quantified a need of 2,100 units for AMIs under 100% and for jobs in Sammamish. Now, that was when Sammamish was tiny, comparatively. Never have any numbers been quantified since. And of course, you can't quantify a number except legislatively. It's a decision, but the factors can all be quantified and made a part of the process and have legislative determinations made. So that gets a X. It's not checked in either the comp plan or in the target back in 2020 and 2021. And I assert that I'm not going to be a Sith Lord and say only. The vast majority of affordable housing needs is for no resident that lives here. It's for workforce housing. What there is a huge amount of folks that own houses that can't buy anything in the price ranges, but in this, they couldn't sell and find something else to buy here, as Mary said. So I don't want to go into all the specifics because I've turned it in, but I do want to share something. In the first 6 months in Sammamish, I need to lay one piece of context for this. At 200,000 income, that's an area median income of 150%. Census data stops at 200,000. When you want to get into incomes over 200,000, you have to use PUMs. I'm not going to go into that now, but I've got it all. But there's an example I want to share. So at 200,000, up to that, I can get how many households there are in all these income levels from the U.S. Census. Over 200,000, you have to do it a whole nother way. a lot harder and you need help, but I got help. So here's the statistic. For the first 6 months in 2024, in Sammamish specifically, the number of households at 2022 income levels, because 2023 isn't available until October, that make under 200,000 is 45% of households. What percentage of homes sold in those 6 months at under 980,000? Because that's the number that a 200,000 income can qualify for with a 25% down and 5% interest. What's the number? 13%. How many households are over 200,000 on 2022? Well, that answer is 55%. What percentage of sales were there in Sammamish over 980,000? 87%. That's a 30% margin, and that is a big gap, but there are several others. So I don't have time to speak further about all this, but the internal gaps for 500,000 to 1,400,000, and for some high-end condominiums and townhouses over 1.4, like many of our other jurisdictions have, are 5 to 10 times the size of our affordable housing need. So, but I also, and I'll call and talk to David or talk to you guys individually, but I am not as clear that the 2,100 is not an absolute, and there's nowhere in the comp plan that says market rate can be built. Those things need to be addressed in the comp plan to be clear. Appreciate the chance to speak.
Thanks, Paul. Who else for the public hearing? Anybody online?
We don't have anybody online.
I'll stop asking. Last chance. Okay, I'm going to close the public hearing. Would someone like to make a motion? Or maybe I should rephrase that. Would someone please make a motion?
I'd like to make a motion to extend by 30 minutes.
Let's do more than that.
I'd like to make a motion to extend by 60 minutes.
Let's just say 9:30.
I'd like to make a motion to extend to 9:30.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to extend to 9:30. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Thank you. Would anyone like to make a motion about the comp plan recommendation to the City Council? And there is one I saw in the packet, so you could read it if you wanted to do that.
Okay, I'll stick my neck out. I move to recommend to the City Council the 2024 Sammamish Comprehensive Plan as presented in Exhibit 2.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded to recommend the 2024 comp plan to the City Council. Any discussion that anyone would like to have about this?
I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
So I'd like to suggest an amendment based on what Michael said. Because as I've glanced at this, his concern about the proximity of residential with high-rise is not clear. And I think, and maybe, I don't know what the right way to state the amendment would be, but what I would suggest is that under land use 2.10, which says design standards and development regulations should support the following values. And it has compatibility with natural features, retention of trees, emphasis of human scale. There would be wording added, and I can't wordsmith it exactly, that would state a reasonable transition between single family or one story and larger. It's the wedding cake kind of
Maybe
concept.
it should just be adjacent.
Adjacency, something, yeah. So if we could play with the correct wording around that kind of amendment, so that would be an addition, right?
Would language along the lines of promote adequate separation between new higher density development and existing lower density development?
We should write
Something
that
like that.
No, that would work. That would, I think, capture the concern, and it is missing in the details here, and I think that would be an appropriate place to put that.
Question? Mike,
I'm going to just, hang on. So if that's a motion to make an amendment,
That's correct.
somebody should second it.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to make this amendment. Now let's discuss.
question, we talked about in the past, we talked about buffer zone. That is different. Are you talking about a buffer zone, basically an open space, a linear open space in between?
This is different. This is really.
You're talking about transition.
Right.
So in the other words, it may not address the citizen concern, as I understand it. They wanted to see some
Setbacks.
setbacks.
Right.
Setbacks,
This
which
is
is
different.
it's not setback, it's not a buffer zone. It's basically applying the concept of the wedding cake.
So one comment is that the comp plan is typically, I would say, not the place to get too specific and try to manipulate. I think saying transition,
Is that good
I
enough,
believe,
David, for you?
leaves that opportunity to,
Is that general enough for you?
I think it's great. We could massage the language, but I think we got what we need. We heard the comment. I don't disagree. I don't think Jeff disagrees. Jeff, do you disagree? So we'll work on that and bring that back. Yeah.
heated agreement. So the one question I have is, I guess my perception was a little bit that with the current land use map and the requirements by the state, is it even possible for us to do that?
I think it is, and I think it's primarily around the R1 zone, which is when we get to the later presentation, we'll go through that. But we're treating the R1 zone a little bit differently in that it will get the base number of units we're required to provide per lot, but not any of the other enhancements that we're looking at in some of the other zones. And the idea would be that over time, if there are certain conditions which are laid out in this process, those could be rezoned, but that would be subject to review and approval by the city. So definitely makes sense, I think, around the R1 zone. And, this is a very common approach to take, and I would assume that the city probably has some similar language in their code potentially. But I think we can put together some draft language and at least transmit it so y'all can see it and have that in there before it goes to the council.
Any other discussion about this?
Based on your experience with the other cities, have you come across this issue that there is some residents concerned about separation between R1 zone?
All the time, yeah.
And give us some ideas of how they deal with it. What was your recommendation in those cases?
Well, it's usually proximity and then, some distance, right? So you might say buildings over a certain height can't be within X feet, and within that buffer, it needs to be planted with this type of landscaping and whatnot. So it's usually a distance and then usually some landscape or other features that also provide a buffer.
And all of that would be handled when we update code and things like that. So
Well,
I tried to select language that was more generic for
Yeah.
this amendment.
But I will say that we should include the code response in our code update, so it's also in there.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But yeah.
And the one thing, just so nobody gets their ideas, too big of an idea here, is that the challenge is that under HB 1110, there's specific language in that bill that says that we cannot make regulations for middle housing types more restrictive than the underlying single family zoning. So we have to be very careful here. And I think what Jeff's saying is in the R1, we have a way we can do that. It becomes more challenging between the R4 and R6 and R8.
Right.
So we may not be able to do that because then we would have to apply that to the single family as well, which maybe that's not a big deal, but then you have an efficient use of land issue. So we're trying to find that balance point here. I hear the comment. I really appreciate working with Michael and hearing from him and his neighbors about how this might work. And we're confident we can try to find a solution that works in the most blaring example of the densities and how those fit together.
Anything else? Okay, so I'm going to call a question and ask to vote on the amendment. All those in favor of this amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay, the amendment is approved. So now we are back to recommending to the city council the 2024 comp plan as presented and amended. Further discussion? Go ahead, Syed.
I have a question. I'm going to send you a list of editorial and all that. How would you suggest to make that as a part of the motion? Mostly editorial, mostly some questions, some clarifications and all that.
So as a commissioner, you could independently send that to the council from as your perspective as an individual commissioner. You could also attend council
That gives the
meetings.
impression that the staff and the planning commission, they don't agree. That's why.
So it would be hard to integrate it as part of this recommendation at this point in time because we have not had the chance to review it. And your fellow commissioners haven't had the chance to review it and concur with it, if you will. So that would, just the timing of it all, right?
How about those questions and comments that are previously sent and you responded, I'm on the record?
Yeah, those are on the record and will be provided to the council as part of the record when it gets to them. So
Okay.
we typically include.
And everybody has seen it.
Packet, yeah, we typically include that. We really appreciate getting questions in advance of hearings like that. That's helpful for us to understand where we might need to add some information and et cetera. And what we will transmit to the council is the recommendation and all of the dialogue and the question and answer that we've had with the commission.
And again, I want
and the public
to kind
comments.
of appreciate and express my appreciation to you and your staff that you have given us written comment, Evan too, that he was kind enough to send us that chart.
You will see that sent and forwarded with the packet that goes to the council.
Other discussion? I have to admit that I'm struggling to read the plan now because I've read it enough times that I can't hardly see it anymore, right? Because it just, if there were changes, I would never see them because I've gone over it. I can't imagine how you guys do that. All right, if there's no more comments, then I'm going to call for the question on the main motion, which would be to recommend to the City Council the 2024 comp plan as presented this evening and amended with Mike Bresco's amendment. All those in favor of making that recommendation to the City Council, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. I'm going to use the gavel for that. Thank you. I feel like we should have a little round of applause. Good job. All right. Got an hour left here, folks. Let's move on to our next topic.
Can I suggest a quick break?
Yes, John, let's take a 5-minute break. So it's, let's call it 8:30. We'll be back here at 8:35 and see you then. Thanks. Yeah, go get a ticket first. I think we're going to figure that one out. I got yours. All right, let's get started. Chair Bresco's anxious for the next topic, apparently. All right, our next topic is a discussion and a public hearing about a docket request that was recommended and has been further developed. So I'll turn it over to Evan and David for some discussion about this.
Sure. Good evening, Planning Commission. Evan Fisher, Community Development. And tonight, we're going to be taking a required legislative step as part of the docket process for a citizen-initiated text amendment that was docketed last year. As a citizen-initiated request, staff's role is to provide the information needed for the Planning Commission to make its recommendation to City Council. Tonight, the Planning Commission will hear a brief presentation explaining the proposed text amendments and the docket process. Staff will then answer any questions that the Commission has on the topic. Following that, the Commission will open a public hearing, hear public comment, close the hearing, and deliberate on recommending the proposed text amendments to the City Council for inclusion in the 2024 Comprehensive Plan. Please note that Title 24A requires that any actions or recommendations the Commission takes tonight must be directly related to the proposed text amendments. Before we jump into the proposal itself, I thought it'd be helpful to quickly go over the process of a comprehensive plan amendment outside of the periodic update. Sammamish operates under the Growth Management Act, which directs cities to do a periodic update to the comprehensive plan now every 10 years. In between periodic updates, an annual review may occur, which allows two types of amendments. This process is set up by SMC Title 24A. The first type of amendment is a site-specific land use map amendment to change a designation for a property or small group of properties on the comprehensive plan's future land use map. The second type of amendment is a text amendment, which changes the text of the comprehensive plan or the Sammamish Municipal Code development regulations. Tonight's application is a result of a text amendment proposal that was docketed during the annual review in 2023. Docket requests may be submitted year-round, with the submitted request being polled once a year at 5 p.m. on the first Monday of August. Requests get presented to the Planning Commission and City Council, with the City Council deciding which requests warrant further consideration the following year by placing those requests on the docket. This docket item was considered last fall by the Planning Commission on November 2nd and docketed by the City Council on December 5th. Once a text amendment is docketed, the applicant has 30 days to submit a text amendment application that provides more detail about the proposal, completes a SEPA non-project checklist, and describes compliance with Title 24A's decision criteria. Once the review has been completed by staff, the application proceeds to legislative review with the Planning Commission and City Council, with the City Council making the decision on whether the application is approved or denied. Should these text amendments be approved by the City Council, they will be integrated and adopted with the 2024 Comprehensive Plan at the end of the year. So now we'll get into the application. The applicant is Eastlake Development LLC. And the applicant asked the city to create a new land use goal in the Sammamish Comprehensive Plan related to the creation of neighborhood centers throughout the city and indicate the Eastlake property as a neighborhood center on the Comprehensive Plan's future land use map. Eastlake Development LLC submitted a revision to their application to include proposed policies or amendments to existing policies that further refine their amendment. Over the next few slides, we'll run through this proposed policy language and staff's recommendation on each. The first is a new proposal, a new policy that would encourage the use of development agreements to provide flexibility for development proposals. And I won't read the whole thing at you, but staff recommend adopting this policy. The next is encourage the development of new neighborhood centers, which are designed to provide a variety of housing options and or create important road and public trail connections. Staff also recommend adopting this policy. The next is another new policy, and I should state these first three have been in the land use element. to encourage development and provide design flexibility when a project will result in long-term preservation of open space, protection of tree canopy, improved stormwater management, and protection of critical areas. Staff recommend adopting as amended, and instead of the word encourage, we recommend allow this type of development. The next is another new policy within the land use element. This would be to encourage recreational and ecotourism uses that provide an overall environmental benefit to the city of Sammamish. Again, staff recommend adopting, but with minor amendments. So instead of encourage, it would be prioritize recreational ecotourism uses that demonstrate an overall environmental benefit for the city. The next proposal would be a revision to land use policy LU 2.8, and it would be adding a sub-policy F that would state provide important road and or public trail connections to neighborhood centers. Staff recommend adopting this revision. The next would be in the environmental stewardship section of the land use element. And this is a revision which would add the words, which would read as use measures such as development incentives, development agreements, regulation, acquisition, and other means to preserve habitat and or natural areas critical to wildlife, salmonids, and pollinators. Staff recommend adopting this revision. The next is a new policy under environmental stewardship, support development proposals, which result in the preservation and protection of critical areas, natural areas, and provide areas that will preserve as permanent open space. Staff just recommend a minor word edit to add or after natural areas and or provide areas that will be preserved as permanent open space. The next is a revised policy, again, under environmental stewardship, which would read promote growth management strategies and encourage development proposals which protect air, water, land, and energy resources. Staff recommend this revision. The next would be a new policy under the transportation element, which reads support private development proposals which provide important connections to roads and trails. Staff recommend this. A new proposal under the parks element, which reads support private development proposals which provide important trail connections. Again, staff recommend this. On to the last two, another revision under the parks element, work cooperatively with property owners and developers and support proposals which preserve habitat and native vegetation. Staff recommend this. And then finally, a revised policy under economic development, which would read bring the community bring the community together by planning, designing, and delivering a range of retail, restaurant, cultural and social amenities and ecotourism uses in places that are engaging, green, and walkable. Title 24A requires applications be reviewed using the criteria you see on screen. I'll provide a summary of the applicant's responses as we go through each of these criteria, but you can find the responses in the applicant's provided application materials in Exhibit 1 of your packets. Starting with criteria 1, which requires consistency with state, regional, or local planning policies. The applicant's materials state the creation of neighborhood center designation was one of the housing diversification toolkits items reviewed by the Planning Commission and City Council. East Lake's proposal generally aligns with the Growth Management Act's policies and recent mandates throughout the state of Washington to provide opportunities for middle housing. Moving to criteria 2, the applicant addresses changing circumstances by citing that recent state and regional and county initiatives have mandated and encouraged cities to provide middle housing, resulting in less larger homes and an increase in smaller housing units. Neighborhood centers would create an opportunity for middle housing. And then responding to criteria 3, the proposed amendments create policies that recognize the heritage and character of the community, provide a benefit to those who live in Sammamish, and assist the city in meeting its planning requirements. I might have lost my notes on the last bit of that. but we'll call that good. So briefly, I just want to provide a big picture of what this text amendment process is and what it isn't. So what this is would be, it is proposing policies or amendments to policies in the 2024 comprehensive plan. Ultimately, these policies create a framework that would allow for future neighborhood centers, ecotourism uses, and development outcomes that provide those listed environmental protections and stormwater management, et cetera. To be clear, what this is not any type of development proposal. Should a future neighborhood center be proposed, it will go through all of the required planning and environmental review processes. And lastly, it's also not an approval of any sort of design, concept, or idea. That would all be done at a later stage. So highest level, this is creating a policy framework in the comp plan that would allow for these types of future uses. So listed on the screen are some options for the Planning Commission's consideration. Option 1 would be to recommend the text amendments as listed by the applicant in Exhibit 1. Staff's recommendation would be option 2, to recommend the approval of the amendments with staff's minor text modifications. Option 3 would be either of those as modified by the Planning Commission, and then option 4 would be to not recommend. And with that, Mr. Boffman, I'll turn back to you.
Thanks, Evan. Who has questions about this? Go ahead, Syed.
It's a simple question. Can you elaborate ecotourism? What is going to be? Where's the definition? Do we have a write-up on that can be basically reflected in the comp plan?
Do you have a universal? Do you know that?
Yeah, so ecotourism is sort of a universally understood concept, and it's been widely studied. In fact, there's entire college degrees on ecotourism these days. So ecotourism is basically where you're able to find a balance between providing infrastructure for tourism in a property or area that is balanced with ecological preservation. And typically the theme of the visitation or the tourism is celebrating the resource and becoming educated on the resource. And an example of that might include, as I understand, Eastlake Development, and I believe Mr. Eastman, who represents Eastlake Development this evening, to be here to provide public testimony as part of the hearing. But as I understand this, the concept is to potentially build within some of the area of the Eastlake Holdings some form of trying to think of the right, pods or some form of place to stay immersed in the hillside with very low impact trails and parking down by the parkway, if you will. So what that would be is a new way to invite visitors to the city that utilizes property in a way that's very low impact and allows for environmental education, interpretation, and really is designed to be integrated into the environment without extreme or significant modification of the environment.
Do we need to define that and put it in writing somewhere or somebody else that?
That could be a recommendation of the commission as part of this, is to maybe adopt these plus also add a definition of ecotourism. I think we could easily find in professional
Simple
planning documents an existing definition that we could just incorporate.
And do we have an example in the Puget Sound region what ecotourism?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's like, for example, there was a show on tree houses, right? And Puget Sound is very, very well known for some very well thought out tree houses that are, you don't even know they're there, but yet they're immersed in a tree, and they've been designed to not impact the growth of the tree. And I can't remember the name of the show, but it's like one of those HGTV shows about tree houses. So that's an example.
I hate to admit it, but I know that it's Treehouse Masters.
Treehouse Masters.
And yes, I have seen maybe one or two
But
episodes.
that is a show. Do we have in Puget Sound region an area that is?
Oh, those are in the Puget Sound region.
Oh, that's in the region?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I should go and look at it.
Again, falsity, but I don't really watch the show.
There's a wide range of examples. If you just Googled ecotourism Puget Sound, I'm sure you'd find hundreds of hits on that.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Ajay.
Evan, can you please go to number 4 of your table? One more back. You had one where you said that demonstrable or... No,
I think it's-
demonstrate. Exactly. This is the one. Recreation, ecotourism uses that demonstrate an overall environmental benefit for the city of Sammamish. Right? That's just a recommendation, right? We are not giving them a rubric right now, along with this, to say that this is how you demonstrate that.
Correct. What this would do would set a policy that we want to figure out a way to quantify how benefits would be demonstrated, and then through a rulemaking process, we define how you demonstrate that, what the criteria.
So the ruling process would decide that, not this.
But the
word.
rulemaking process, right?
Yeah,
Not the
correct.
policy.
The rulemaking process, not this. Not this statement doesn't do that.
Right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, John.
So just to be clear in my mind, the text amendments to the comp plan expand the definitions and uses within any neighborhood center created by the city.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question was kind of in line with what these guys have asked. Is there anything about this that, so this is written to me largely focused on some underlying intent of a specific area. Is there anything about the language that could influence, or more appropriately restrict, somebody else trying to develop another neighborhood center someplace else? I mean, because if you're trying to build something and you're putting, like we described, a couple stores on a couple of corners and maybe a couple of apartments or something, ecotourism doesn't apply. I would just want to make sure that, because this has been written with sort of a general direction in mind, that can't necessarily restrict somebody else trying to do something different.
I think that's a good note, and I think we should maybe just run through and cross-reference the existing language around neighborhood centers in the comp plan. I think generally I see these as additive to, and not, it just provides more options for all neighborhood centers, but it's worth just a cross-check to make sure.
It's also nuanced to specific conditions. So, for example, in order for us to prioritize recreational ecotourism uses that demonstrate overall environmental benefit, they'd have to be relevant to environmental benefit. I mean, we would still allow other recreational and ecotourism uses, but we wouldn't prioritize those. I think what this is saying is that when you can try and make that balance actually work, it's really worth us trying to figure out how to allow that in the city. So it really necessitates that you have all of the conditions around that for this to even apply. So I don't think it would reduce opportunities from others. However, it might set this type of proposal ahead of the others in terms of what we're looking for.
Okay. Anyone else?
Wait a minute. I'm a little bit confused. Your response to John's comment was that, as I understood, that these guidelines could apply to the other areas, but not only to Mr. Eastman's property. But now, in response to Chair's question, it looks like, no, that is not the case. Am I missing something in between two different answers?
It could apply to any property in the city where those conditions existed, right? But not all the properties in the city have.
That's
those
understandable,
conditions.
but these guidelines applies through the city, not on any. If one area meets these requirements, then those guidelines applies, right?
Absolutely. I think, that another example might be, so recall that as part of Mr. Eastman's submittal, he also provides a narrative around the history of the city and its role as a sort of an ecotourism destination before we even knew what ecotourism was. So back in the day when it used to take all day to get to Pine Lake from Seattle.
By the way, it still does sometimes.
that Pine Lake was an actual ecotourism destination. And, so say somebody wanted to create a private park on Pine Lake that restored the shoreline, added access to the water, and did a whole bunch of things. Well, we might want to consider that as a great opportunity, even for a private park, right? So that would apply in that instance.
Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, so just to be clear, you're going to change the demonstrate to is relevant or something like that, right? Is that what I heard?
It's only relevant to properties where that condition exists. So,
okay, it's
so
only relevant to that problem.
Yeah, so
okay.
in those cases where it applies, they have to demonstrate, but we still have to create the regulation as to how to show they demonstrate, which we're going to work on next. That's the next step.
Got it. Okay, got it. I got confused. Thanks a lot.
Anything else? Okay, thanks. Let's do a quick public hearing. So I'll open the public hearing about this item, and who would like to make 7-minute public comments? Mr. Eastman, I'm so shocked. Go ahead.
Commissioner Boffman, you're on a roll tonight. You've had a lot of quick one-liners, and I think maybe it was a time off last week or something, but you've come back real fresh. So I got the note. I'll keep this really quick. James Eastman, East Lake Sammamish Parkway. I've been at this now. I think I've owned my land for almost 18 years. I got my son with me. He's going to be an 8th grader. He's a giant. He's probably going to be bigger than me soon, but he probably thinks that this is the most boring meeting, and here I am just enthralled, like totally zoomed in to what's going on. And I was thinking to myself, I've never been here this late in July, so I appreciate everybody even being here, everyone from the city and you guys. And I thought, okay, we'll ride our bikes here. It'll be great. We'll ride our bikes home. And here I am looking outside thinking, oh man, it's dark out. Like I'm gonna be riding home in the dark, but luckily we have real lights to keep some visibility on the road. But you guys know me. I'm really good at creating a vision. I got a lot of wild ideas, a lot of good ideas, but I lack building the framework and the legislative process. And I appreciate the city staff, planning commission, city council, and their ability to actually build this framework to make these ideas possible. And that's where Kimley Horn came into play. That's what they do. They were able to see my vision and then build a framework to see how that could benefit the city as a whole as part of the comp plan. So those are the revisions and the updates that you see tonight are the result of taking this and meeting with people that create this framework. So I hope that you'll approve it, and this will be one of many more public hearings to come. Building out, a neighborhood center on my property, and hopefully some more throughout the city. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Anybody else? Mary?
Hi, Mary Wichter, Sammamish, 24 years. Mary Malaitner called me one time and said, Mary, you're the frequent flyer for text amendments. Because when I started, you couldn't actually do a text amendment. You could only do comp plan amendments. And then when you do a text amendment, you don't necessarily get them passed. So I wanted to speak in full support of what James has here, and all the changes that you've made seem fine. It is a great thing to be able to go to your city, read the code, and see that there are either things that you don't have that you would like to have, or have something added to it that would make it better for everyone. And I believe that James has done that all the way around, and he is very visionary. He's collected a lot of acreage together that he can do some very special things with. And on special uses, when I first moved here, I didn't know, but then I learned that there are tree houses in Redmond, like it's like a Airbnb or something, and you can go spend a night. So it's kind of like a motel thing, and I always thought that was really cool. And then I watched some of those tree house shows. There's more than one. They're pretty fun. And I just think that anything we can do with ecotourism where you're not building the heat problems with impervious and you're not ripping down trees and you're doing slopes, I guess maybe on my behalf and on James' behalf and anybody's, the city always talks about partnering with people to be able to do things. And you might have places where there would be connections or roads or trails or management of stormwater to clean it up and get it controlled so that it isn't jetting a whole ton of phosphorus into the lake. And instead of just making the developer do that, I'm hoping that you would partner, because a lot of it's coming from the development above him, and he's spoken to that. And I think he even did a 7-minute video at one of your meetings. It was pretty incredible to watch. So I really hope that you will work toward that, because it will improve the land, the area, the safety, the people, the existing development that the city permitted, and then his uses of it for wider and best use for everybody. Just partnerships are important, and I'd like Sammamish to be a leader in doing that, and I think you can come up with something very unique that he's looking forward to the city. Just on the wording, I know when this came through months ago, they were talking about neighborhood centers versus sub-area plans, and I don't know if you should try to widen it to make it more so you could be either one of those, because I think as you look at what you're doing with the comp plan and the housing needs and the different things, maybe we need to make sure that we have hooks or ways things could get implemented for sub-area plans too. So I ask you to just think about neighborhood centers. Could it also apply to sub-area plans? Or are there different things there? I know that critical drainage areas were in King County Code, and there was a hook to do them, but there was no code for it, and that's how we got the landslide hazard area going to landslide hazard drainage area going to landslide hazard area. So I think whenever you're doing code, you have to go like you guys have been. Are we hurting something else? Are we requiring somebody else? And then try to see if there's anything bigger. And the only other thing that I think is like neighborhood centers is the sub-area plans, but I haven't read the code very much, and I know David Pyle will be an expert on that. So the last thing is, in doing dockets, there is a docket process that Miriam's done before. It's online all year long. It's just a jot form where you can just type in text like sentences or a few things. And you can submit them anytime. You can submit it at 3 in the morning in February. You can submit them in July or December. And then what they do is they wrap up any inputs that they've received by 5 p.m. And this year it'd be on the first Monday in August, which is August 5th. And then they take those, and then if they kind of qualify, then there's a process that you go through the fourth quarter. So you submit it and they have to approve it, and there's multiple steps, and then they have to decide if they're staff or not. But the reason I'm going through this is if other people with these bonus parcels or other things coming up, if you have ideas or ways that could kind of make the city better or make the development work better, that you think about those, because anybody can submit a text amendment. And I know that some of the things might not be able to be done this year in 2024, so I didn't even know, maybe I was thinking about maybe submitting an open one and saying, hey, with all this stuff we've got on the plate, if there's something that didn't get in, can we have a work plan item for 2025? Because the city always has the right to do that, but you can submit as a person, and then the city can actually take on your text amendments. So text amendments are required to be allowed. I think you get in trouble if you don't let people submit them. And then they're kind of a joint thing where the people in the city can work together to make our city and where we live better. So I just want to give you the rundown on that, and I won't use my full 5 minutes, but fully support what's going on here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary. Mr. Stickney.
Hello, planning commissioners. I'll spit out the P. Paul Stickney here. I've been following what James has been doing for many years. It's not about him, it's about his site. And I've got a couple odds and ends to speak to in my opinion. I support all this that's been laid out. I think it's well done, and I was particularly pleased to hear the staff's comments about if there's a mix, balance that is net positive, I'll use that term, why not consider that? So there's a few things I'd like to talk about. Over the years, I've been aware of a very, what I consider to be onerous blanket policy of a no disturbance zone. That is altering somewhat in this current comp plan correctly, in my view, to do site-specific analysis so that if whatever is proposed is net positive, I'm going to use my own term, it's okay. But if not, it should not be done. But I think much of Eastman's property was under that old zone, which was not the same as most things in the city. So I applaud the analysis of what's right over just a prescriptive overlay that gives no flexibility. So that's a piece. Second thing is, I think that potentially some language might want to be worked into critical areas over stormwater versus natural flow in streams. And just to give a very straightforward example, and it may be way more complex than this, but since I don't know the complexity, I can't say it. If 20 years ago, before development in Sammamish, a bunch of the channels carrying water on Eastman property weren't, and that's mostly stormwater upstream that is put in pipes that runs down, that's not natural. That should be managed in a way that, as James has talked about with me, collect it, treat it, take it down to the, lower lands, put it into a pond, put it into lake, but stop the erosion and all the sediment that comes down from man-made stormwater. Now, if it was a natural creek, whole other ballgame. So I suggest that he be able to, and I'm not speaking for him, I'm speaking my opinion, because I have been following this for many years, as I have most everything that's been happening here in the city. If there's a way to manage the stormwater in net positive ways, that is a overall advantage, especially in sediment transfer and managing flows and water quality. I think that's a real good idea. And the last thing I would comment on is habitat corridors be appropriately applied to do a good job at providing some, but not excessive restriction on use. And I know that's a sort of a sensitive subject for some, but as in one of the comments I made on a reason to do some more housing and things is that, 84% of the four-county area, the habitat and, wildlife habitat gets top priority. In urban land, I think there needs to be a great balance between use for humans and wildlife, but I don't want to get anybody mad in the wildlife habitat arena, but we humans don't have a chance to go into the resource land and rural lands to live at our urban levels. We only get that in 16% of the land. So all I'm asking for is to weigh to what degree habitat has the ability to thrive in the four-county areas in a much larger region than urban, and not to not provide protection, but don't go over the top in an urban area. So that's sort of an overall city theme as well as Eastman. All right, appreciate the chance to speak.
Thanks, Paul. Anybody else? All right, let's close the public hearing. Would someone like to make a motion? Oh, I did it again. Would someone please make a motion?
Boy, let's all jump to it here tonight. Option 2, recommend approval of the application Eastlake Development LLC text amendments as amended and recommended by staff in Exhibit 2 to be incorporated into the 2024 comprehensive plan upon adoption.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to recommend to the City Council approval of this text amendments into the comp plan. Any discussion?
I thought we were going to add a definition for what's ecotourism.
You can sure do that if you want to make an amendment.
I would make that amendment.
I recommend an amendment number 3 to adopt option 2 with a definition for what ecotourism is.
Second?
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to amend the motion to include the suggestion that the staff incorporate a definition of ecotourism into the language changes. Any discussion about that amendment?
I'll jump. I think would be nice to do. I don't think it's necessary because it's easy to do a quick definitional search, and I think it's generally understood, so I'm not sure that it's needed.
Anything else? Okay, we're going to take a vote on the amendment. So the amendment is to suggest that the staff incorporate a definition of ecotourism into the recommended language changes. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. All right, so the amendment passes. Any other discussion on the main motion?
I think it's great. So I think we should say yes.
I love short but sweet comments. Anything else?
Great job, Evan. You did a great job. Thank you. Very simple.
I would say I have great respect for James for sticking with this for literally years. And now I hope he continues to stick with it and we see some cool outcomes as a result. And maybe this will break the ice on some, neighborhood center planning that could get started, and some will work and some won't. And concepts becoming reality is always an interesting thing to see. So if there's nothing else, I'll call a question on this one. All those in favor of recommending according to option 2 as amended with the added language for definition, say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed, no? All right, the motion as amended passes. Thank you, guys. Let's move on to our last topic with this evening, which is discussion about the adjacent code amendments that we're going to be needing to make to the development code to enable the comp plan changes we're talking about. Oh, geez, yeah. How long is this? Yeah, how long is this going to take?
Half hour at the most.
So this is not a public hearing.
Right.
So there's,
But we
there
still
is
have
public
public
comment at the
Yeah.
end.
So let's go
Think
to
we
10.
can do 20 minutes?
Let's
Sure.
go to 10 so that we don't have to do it again.
I move to extend the meeting to 10 p.m.
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded to extend to 10 p.m. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. Thanks. Okay, let's go.
Thank you, Chair Bopp. And I want to first say thank you to everyone for sticking through this all. We plan a much lighter workload in the fall. This is really the bulk of the material in our comp plan update, which happens every 10 years now. So this is not your typical meeting agenda for the summer. So thank you. So back again, David Pyle, Department of Community Development, Jeff Arango with Framework. We are now going to be discussing the enabling regulations associated with the comprehensive plan, specifically related to, I believe this evening, middle housing. We previously come to you with the concepts and again, the regulatory tools and the settings. We've done some additional work on this and some refinements. And I believe we made a lot of progress and are feeling pretty good about where we stand with this. And I'll turn it over to Jeff to do a presentation and walk you through where we stand with the tools and tool settings.
Great. Thank you, David. So we are going to, hold on. At this. Here's our agenda for this topic. We are going to focus mostly on middle housing and ADUs, but we just want to touch on a few other pieces related to that. The unit lot subdivision, which is something that's required for middle housing. Criteria-based rezoned, which is also has a relationship to the middle housing and how we're addressing middle housing in the R1 zone particularly. The bonus parcel provisions, which we mentioned earlier, and then the step housing, which includes like the emergency housing that we discussed earlier. And then we'll have a little bit of time for questions and comments. So just a reminder that, even though some of these provisions like HB 1110 and HB 1337, which is the accessory dwelling unit bill, we are also still focused on implementing the policies in the document that you've just advanced to the City Council. And there is some alignment there. So just for reference, there's a few policies pulled on the left-hand side that speak to it. Talking about supporting middle housing, a range of housing types, which we've heard a lot about, balance, clarity, and objectivity, with flexibility for design innovation, and looking at potential barriers to housing production, which is something that we're looking at in Town Center, and you'll be seeing some of that coming back to you here as well. So the middle housing applies generally in the yellow areas, which are the single-family zones. We've created kind of two what we're calling overlay zones to be able to apply this. One is in the R4, the other is in the R6 and the R8. In the R1 zone, we're simply going to... Oh, it was double looking me up. I think you just want to hit on it. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about that. In the R1, we're going to go with a more basic approach of just allowing the base number of units, sort of more of a minimal compliance approach. And then properties would have an opportunity to go through an administrative permit process. If the right conditions are met, they're in the right proximity to another zone, they could request for example, a switch to an R4, in which case the overlay would then apply. So I think that also speaks a little bit to the issue we talked about earlier around compatible development. And so this process, I think, helps address that issue as well. Okay, so a couple of the levers, so to speak, the standards that we're looking at that can help address bulk and scale and really compatibility within existing Sammamish neighborhoods. Some of these are addressed in the middle housing model ordinance that the state has put out. They do recommend some FAR limits there, and just to give you some context, we are recommending some lower levels that we think are more appropriate for Sammamish. So we put the basics of the FAR system in place as part of Development Regs Phase 2 because of the general concerns of very large homes on very small lots. That, in addition to the standards around lot size that I mentioned earlier and the criteria you would need to get below a standard lot size, are going to be big, really help with that kind of controlling the bulk and scale. So the single family home FAR will remain at 0.5, and then there's an escalator, which I think we showed more detail on a subsequent slide. So it's scalable to lot size and to some extent number of units. We're going to maintain maximum building coverage, which is in place currently. We've done some kind of design testing, and we think that generally works. I think it's around 50%, so the rest of it would be open space or some parking potentially. A new standard that we're proposing, something that is not in place today, but is becoming more favorable in communities, really, I think, across the country, is a maximum building footprint of 3,000 square feet. So essentially, if you could build 3 stories, I mean, most developments are 2 stories, but if you build 3 stories, the maximum square footage you could have in one building would be 9,000 square feet. So you're not going to get taller buildings or large apartment buildings. It's really to keep it at that sort of neighborhood scale. Now, those that have larger lots and for whatever reason desire more square footage, they could build multiple buildings. They could somehow connect them in a way, but an individual building would be capped at that limit, regardless of lot size. The middle housing types we've covered, but there's a provision to require allow 6 of 9. We had done a lot of work on that last year, presented that to the council, and I think have a good sense of what those 6 of 9 are. There's some limitations on parking. I don't think are really going to be that big of a deal because most properties already exceed that. We are looking at, some accommodations for street parking, but only if certain conditions are met. And then trying to encourage, the use of alleys. There's some great alley examples in Sammamish that we used during phase 2 development regs to show. And it really just makes access and parking in particular and arrangement of open space just a lot more efficient. Not to say that it necessarily would be a requirement per se, but something that we want to encourage. So one of the things that the commission asked last time was for us to provide a comparison of the existing standards and what we're proposing in the overlay. So you can see that on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is what we're proposing for the overlay. So right now, those densities are 1, 4, 6, and 8. They just track with the numbers indicated in the zone designations. We've selected kind of 2 middle housing types or scales of density. One is 12, one is 18. And those apply, the MHO1 applies to the R4, the other applies to the R6 and R8. In many cases, the 12 and 18 units is going to be less dense than what you could do on a small existing lot. So it's not like an accelerator per se. Once you get to some typologies that are beyond the basic number of units we need to provide per lot, we thought maintaining a density cap still made sense. And these are, pretty typical middle housing densities. We did show, I think, earlier that on some of the existing small lots, the densities can exceed that, but that's a basic compliance that we have to allow per the state law. So if you have a smaller lot and you're putting 3 units on it, you could potentially get more dense than that. But if you have a larger lot, you would not be able to exceed that. So in a way, it's kind of balancing out how the densities are applied and work across zones. The existing floor to area ratio is capped at 0.5, but that's really because it's only single family we're talking about and maybe ADUs. We've just figured out a unit increment based on the number of units on a lot that you could get up to. And again, this is lower than what was recommended in the state model code. And I should also say that prior to development regs phase 2, there was no cap. It was basically unlimited. So this is tamped down quite a bit from what predated that effort. So a few other things, minimum lot width. We are recommending a little bit of a change there with a driveway front loaded onto a street. We're recommending a little bit wider lot if someone wants to do a subdivision and propose a lot that has rear access or use of an alley. That can work with a little bit of a narrower lot. It doesn't change the lot size. And again, unless someone's preserving open space or meeting some other public benefit, they're going to default to that standard lot size, which is basically just dividing an acre by the numbers that you see up top, R1, R4, R6, R8. That'll give you the standard lot size. So a few other things. We're trying to maintain some emphasis on walkways and accessibility for pedestrians. Looking at how we deal with vehicle access for alleys. If there's access from an alley, the preference would be not to have a curb cut. That's kind of the purpose of the alley, and it can make the street frontage a bit more walkable by removing any sort of conflicts across driveways between pedestrians and vehicles. Parking location, we did do some parking standards you see on the left-hand side of the chart or table regarding the width of driveways. In phase 2 development regs, we're generally maintaining that with some little bit of a modification regarding the setbacks there on the right-hand side. Required parking spaces right now is 2 per dwelling, and I think we're proposing the reductions that are allocated or specified in the state law. It's based on lot size, so if it's smaller than 6,000 square feet, you can't require more than 1. If it's larger, you can require 2. I think our recommendation would be to try to keep it more towards 1 per stall, but also allowing some flexibility where there's available street parking for that also to count towards the requirement. And then a couple of things. So there are some dynamic setbacks that the city put in place, I think in phase one development regs. We're proposing to keep those in place. It was something we looked at in phase two and felt like those should continue. So for single family homes of those size, that would remain. We are recommending a bit of a modification to the front setback to 15 feet for middle housing, which is, fairly standard. It still does require a setback, but just a little bit less than the 25-foot max. That's for the single family. 5-foot side yards, pretty standard, allows windows and access to the side of the home. I think the city does allow 0 lot line developments, but that's usually something that needs to be part of a master plan because of the fire walls that are required are difficult to do as an addition. We are recommending, because we're going to be introducing potentially multiple buildings on lots, I mean, something you could do now, but it may become a little bit more common, a space between the buildings of 10 feet. So basically combining those side yard setbacks. So that's pretty consistent with what we have now. We're not changing the building height, so that'll remain. And building footprint max of 3,000, again, that's a new standard, not one that exists today. And we're also, again, proposing to apply it to the single family. Just real quick, this is just an example of a cut sheet for how the code will work. It'll be very detailed and illustrated out so that all of the letters in the diagrams correspond with specific standards. We're developing these cut sheets for each of the overlays, so it'll avoid the issue of people having to search through multiple parts of the code. There's a bit of redundancy we're trying to sort out, but in general, this will be sort of one-stop shopping for someone to understand what the standards are for middle housing. We'll be bringing this back to you later next month with all of the details in a full draft, but just wanted to give you a sense of how this is being pulled together. Unit lot subdivision, this is something that's required in state law, and this is how you deal with multiple ownership on a lot. So you have first what's called the parent lot, which is the lot as it's configured today, and then you have unit lots, which are essentially the footprint or a little bit more than the footprint with some common open space. So you can see in the diagram in the bottom, it's showing 6 units on this lot and kind of like a cottage housing kind of style. Alley loaded with parking there shown in gray, and then the hatched area would be common open space that would be shared amongst the units or could include some potential private, mix of public and private open space. And then, owners can own the footprint of their lot. If it's a stacked kind of configuration, then the only way would be able to do separate ownership would be through a condominium, which, has historically been challenging in Washington, but does happen. So that's kind of how that works. There's a pretty well put together section in the model code around this that we've been making some minor edits to for the code work that we've been doing for Sammamish and for others. So that's generally how that works. Remains to be seen how common, this type of ownership will be versus rental units or remaining under single ownership. So this is the criteria-based rezone. Again, rather than applying one of the overlays to the R1, we wanted to facilitate a process where rezoning could happen. Typically, rezoning is more of a legislative process, but there is an ability to develop more of a permit kind of based by right approach if certain criteria are met. So this would allow rezoning through a type 2 action from a lower intensity zone to a higher intensity zone. In order to do that, you'd have to be adjacent to one of the zones that you want to have your zoning changed to, which would be a limited number of properties, not result in major excavation or result in critical area buffer reduction. There's provisions in critical areas, rules that talk about reasonable use if your property is encumbered. We don't want to combine that with an upzone. Must demonstrate sufficient water and sewer capacity within proximity to existing and planned transit stop potentially, proximity to an existing or planned sub-area or neighborhood center, and that construction would not require a drainage adjustment. So those are some of the criteria that we're working with, and again, it will help with some of the compatibility issues. The rezoning, some of the rezoning, should it happen from an R1, say, to an R4, could still happen through the legislative process. It's just that there would be a clearer path for a certain number of properties that met the criteria. The bonus parcel provision, this is where we would be allowing a density bonus on properties owned by religious organizations or public entities, like the Sewer and Water District, the King County Park and Ride, city-owned properties. And basically this would allow a density bonus for, just for affordable housing. It could include wraparound services, like we discussed earlier. If one of these parcels was in a commercial zone, those uses would also still be allowed. So there could be a development that incorporated commercial, but if it's in a residential zone, then it's just going to be the residential uses plus something that would be considered an accessory to an affordable housing project like a daycare. We're looking at developing form-based standards that would allow essentially mid-rise, ability to provide the city with a parking analysis and parking study by a qualified professional, look at opportunities for being able to shared parking and manage parking effectively and make sure that it's covered for both the housing use and for the existing use on the property if there is one. So this is pretty exciting, and as David said, we've had some conversations about it, and there seems to be quite a bit of interest. Step housing, which is emergency shelter, transitional housing, emergency housing, and permanent supportive. We are permitted to develop some reasonable standards. There is some state guidance that was recently put out that's on Department of Commerce's website that we've been incorporating. But the updates are relatively straightforward for this. First, it involves some changes to the use chart, and basically where certain other uses are allowed, you have to allow these housing uses. So wherever hotels and motels are allowed, even if there aren't any existing, we have to allow them as a permitted use. In the zones that allow single family or multifamily, we have to allow transitional and permanent supportive. So we are incorporating that, and will be part of the package we bring back to you. And with that, we'll turn it back over for questions and comments.
Okay, who's got questions? Syed, go ahead.
Okay. One of the slide, Jeff, you're talking about hardscape coverage for R1 zone is 30%. What was the justification to go to the 75% for the R8? Why? Why triples?
Smaller lots.
Is the hardscape would include the footprint of the building?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't include, it's not the outside, it's not the parking lot, it's not.
Yeah, it would include like if there's a building coverage standard and a lot coverage, the building would be included in that. So it's not in addition to. So 50% of that is building, the rest would be other site features.
Parking. What do you think about the possibility for multi-unit for R4 and R8 zone to designate or create an area for visitors parking? So it would not be per individual, it would be for the overflow. I heard it from a number of people that they made a comment about that issue that has to be dealt with.
Yeah, so per the provisions in state law, we couldn't require that, but I think it could be something that we could encourage, I suppose. The other thing, I think, in locations where there's on-street parking, that could serve as guest parking. Once you start to get to apartments, then we could require guest parking, but that's obviously not part of the middle housing proposal.
But something to think about it.
Yeah.
Side lot setback. 25 feet for R1 is 10 feet. Why such a big setback for the R1 zone, 25 feet? It's so much. That's a side setback.
Yeah, large lots.
We need that much?
Well, I don't think it's really going to impact if it's just a single family home on
Well,
one lot.
mostly that I have seen in the R1 zone is about 10 feet, 10, 15 feet.
Well, but we've also heard from property owners in the R1 that they would prefer not to be right next to the property. So, I mean, they also have some ability, if they're developing their site, to think about over the long term, you know, what their interest is in terms of maintaining vegetation buffers and things like that. So they have a bit of a role potentially if they're developing their property. So that's the only reason.
Yeah, you had a schematic drawing showing a unit lot, lot. Can you go right there, right
Yeah.
there? What would be typically, if you look at the one of those lots, the parent lot, give me some idea of the dimension. The lower one or the upper one?
It's very diagrammatic.
I know, but generally, is that 100 feet plus or minus?
Well, if you assume the bottom one was
I'm
an
trying to
acre.
visualize how it looks like. With
Yeah.
6 units in one lot.
Yeah, I think the bottom one looks close to an acre to me. Again, it's not, it's just meant to be diagrammatic. But if you did an acre squared, that would probably give you the rough, I can't do that in my head, but
R7. That would be 7 units, right?
yeah.
Yeah. If that was a rough acre. But there, yeah, I mean, it really depends. And so if you think about what we're saying is that those footprints would be maximum size 3,000 square feet, that the total FAR across that site would be a starting point of 0.5, and for every additional unit added would go up by 0.15. So
Yeah.
0.5 then to 0.65. And so if you counted the number of units, you'd figure the FAR that would be allowed.
Yep.
Which would govern the actual unit sizes. That's not to say you couldn't spread it around and make some big and some small. You'd also then, under this scenario, the unit lot division, I think, is where there's the most potential, because the alternative is we end up with these condominium scenarios, which are much harder to manage over time and less desirable for the purpose of ownership. Unit lot division, what I've heard in comment too, is that we want to create both rental opportunities as well as ownership opportunities in the city. And I've heard emphasis on ownership opportunities because that's really where you start to build generational wealth, and you start to include people in the community in a different way than rentals are. So unit lot divisions is one way to make sure that people are actually buying the land underneath their home, and it's a better from our perspective form of ownership than a condominium form of ownership. But that's not to say you couldn't also build a condo. So this is a really good addition to our code, we feel.
Also, David, to the Planning Commission, I sent a comment as far as the changes in the zoning criteria. Did you pass it on to Jeff? The email that I sent to everybody?
I'd have to look for it again, but
Everybody got a copy.
do you recall the?
No? Did you see my, Mark, did you see my email?
Oh, it was an email regarding addition to the criteria for the administrative rezone. Yeah, great. I've had a lot of email on comp plan in the last few days. I'm sorry.
I just want to make sure that you have it, and you had a chance to look at it. I'll propose some changes. Thank you.
Going to send it to us. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? John?
Okay, I'm a little slow tonight. It's getting late. So that I understand the middle housing overlay. So let's say I had an R1 lot and I wanted to build a single family. The existing single family regulations would apply. So I built my house with those in mind, and then I decided I wanted to add 1 or 2 units, separate units. Then I could apply the middle housing overlay for the reduced setbacks and increased
Right.
I want to clarify with that that we are adding a few new tools to the base zoning requirements. So
Okay.
the existing rules plus those that we're adding, because we cannot be more restrictive than the underlying zone. So in order for us to add some things to regulate middle housing, we have to also add it to regulate traditional single family housing.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
Others? I have a couple things, and I'm like John, a little slow, I think, but I was thinking we've talked about development regulations phase 3. Is that still correct, and how does that relate to this stuff right here? The reason is I have a few things that I've always been interested in the next version of the development regulations, and I'm thinking that's coming up maybe at the beginning of next year.
We do have code amendments on our work plan for 2025, and we are working through budgeting for that. Specifically, we don't have a full idea as to what that includes. I want to be really clear that what we're doing here with our middle housing and our administrative rezoning and the other items that were listed in the list previously are also, it's a changing world. We're receiving mandates from the state, whether it's regarding parking or middle housing or affordability or all these things, and we're trying to get it right. And there's always new guidance being pushed out or new case law that's going to drive something. So we anticipate that if we get these rules in place, number one, we want to be nimble. If there's something we missed, we want to be able to come back with a code package pretty quickly in the new year and get that in front of you and get that approved. Or if there are some things we want to add that we feel would be enhancements, we want to also be able to do that. So one thing to keep in mind, just like the transportation master plan that we're working on, is this is our best, we're doing our best work to get this in place according to what the state is directing us to do. We anticipate that we will have to come back in 2025 and make some fine-tuning adjustments to this, which would also be opportunity to take on some of the other things that you as a commission want to consider adding that might not be specific to middle housing or administrative rezones. So I would call that phase 3.
Great. Next item is a kind of a small thing, but I noticed the change to the front setback of 15 feet. And I don't know exactly how that works, but I just urge a little caution there because very few pickups will fit within 15 feet and they'll be hanging out over the sidewalk you just got to be a little careful about the dimensions when you have a driveway.
We require the driveway to be 20 feet back, or like 20 feet in depth. So the 15 would only be if a portion of the building, like if they have a driveway, the garage will have to be 20 feet
Okay,
back.
I just want to make sure.
Good point, yeah.
That's part of the reason I think the 20 feet existed is some of those dimensions. So let's not put something in that then all of a sudden turns into a problem.
My first parking ticket was in Westwood at UCLA for a pickup hanging over the back of the sidewalk.
It was you. The one last thing, which is a little bigger topic that I just encourage thinking about, and we actually talked about this a little bit earlier, but under criteria-based rezone process, I think there might need to be something in there that also says, in addition to these other criteria, that someone who wants to rezone can demonstrate that they and I don't know how you say this exactly, but that it's feasible that they can mitigate impacts to adjacent properties. So whether that's stormwater or daylight or some environmental things or things I can't even think of, but I think there's just some sort of caution about making sure that they can do all these other things, but what's the impact to the adjacent single-family home, and that they have to demonstrate that there's a path to get there. Not solve the problem, but say, here's how we're going to make sure that we're not dumping our stormwater across their yard, or here's how we're going to make sure that their house isn't in the shadow, the whole entire year except for 2 days in July, or whatever, right? Whatever it is. So I think that might be something to consider how you would add that in there as a criteria. No, that was all I had. Anybody else?
Those Those are great suggestions. I appreciate that. It's, and much of that could be achieved through a conditioned rezone. Some city attorneys tend to argue that conditioned rezones are spot zoning. But I have seen many of them be successful. You could use an alternative term, the concomitant, which is kind of like a conditioned rezone, but it doesn't have the legal risk of a conditioned rezone.
Yeah, that was my thought, is that you could condition it on some of these things. So, yeah, okay.
Okay.
The step housing, how successful has that been in the metro area?
Probably depends on who you ask. That's a hard thing for me to answer. I don't have a lot of direct experience with that, just probably what I've seen in the news and whatnot. Again, I think during COVID, what's been happening is the purchase of old motels and conversion. And so, it's serving a need and provided needed housing. Probably the impacts depend on what conditions surround that area and how it's managed. I certainly do have some experience through some of my downtown planning work dealing with this issue. And it presents some challenges, certainly, at certain times, depending on the circumstances. And it's certainly something that creates some dialogue within the community and amongst business owners, but it's really on a case-by-case basis. So there are some things that communities can look at in terms of standards around that, intensity, occupancy, and spacing. So you can put in there are some limits to what you can do, but you can put in some spacing requirements. Emergency shelter, 2 emergency shelters, for example, couldn't be within a certain proximity, but the maximum distances that you're allowed to restrict them to probably aren't going to be have a huge impact in Sammamish. Also my sense is that Sammamish is probably not on the tops of the list of those providers to place those in Sammamish, but that remains to be seen, and we'll have to set up the regulations to accommodate that.
Wasn't it an issue in city of Burien and later on in the city of Kenmore?
There is definitely a situation in the city of Burien. I don't know the particulars around the...
Same with the Kenmore when they started talking about
Well, Kenmore
housing.
was around an affordable housing project that the city decided not to move forward with. In Burien, it's some sort of more complicated issue, I believe, around encampments and the King County Sheriff's Office and so on and so forth. But that's become a whole political hot potato.
Even in Sammamish here, there are some forms currently of step housing in some of the local religious organizations. And I heard from people living adjacent to those places the challenges that they're going through. So it's one of those that, yes, we have all the good intentions, but if we don't manage it and organize it in a good way, the end results can be harmful to the people living next to them.
So with step housing, I attended actually a seminar on this today, put on by the Department of Commerce. And one of the things they highlighted is the Department of Commerce is paying very close attention to what you're doing in your comp plan and your enabling development regulations. And they're paying very close attention to what you're doing in response to their guidance. And there's a list of things you can and cannot do as part of your step regulations. So we need to pay close attention to what they're saying you cannot do, because we need to be compliant. I mean, there's a point where we need to read the legislation ourselves, then read the guidance. Also, there's interpretation that goes along with that. But I will say that it is something that the Department of Commerce has noted that they are paying very specific attention to with comprehensive plans and enabling regulations. So we're going to make sure to study that and make sure that what we're proposing we feel would be compliant and offer up the areas of opportunity where we have flexibility to tailor it to local conditions.
Yep.
Anybody else? Great. David, Jeff, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on to public comment related to actually this topic is the only agenda-related public comment. So let's go ahead and do that. Mary, looks like you're coming up first.
So if I talk loud enough, does everyone wake up? Hi, Mary Wichter again, Sammamish, 24 years. So I did have comments specifically related to the criteria-based rezone process. It has, so it's the second to last page of the packet. It was my email that I mailed in this morning, my first public comment. And on the bullet, it says criteria-based rezone process. They have the things that you can't do and what it must do. The fifth one says must not be encumbered by critical areas. Totally agree with that. What I'd like to do is also have it extended. So on these two maps, this map here with all the orange, and then, or excuse me, yellow and orange, and then this purple. This is a map from 2016 from the Stormwater Comp Plan. It was the first time I saw anybody put multiple layers over. The orange area is a landslide hazard area. That's a critical area. You should not be developing in those. And then the yellow area, because the flows go this way, is the landslide hazard drainage area. That's a drains to area, and it also needs special requirements. So what happened in 2017 to 2019 is we got code adopted that said, hey, this whole thing is just called a critical drainage area. So it's the landslide hazard area itself, which is a critical area, and then it's the landslide hazard drainage area, which is a drains to area, and it was put in one. And then Danica Globokar, who was the senior stormwater manager at the time, she's like, well, hey, we have this stuff for geohazards over on the left side or the western shore of Sammamish. We also want to do things around the lakes because for Beaver Lake and for Pine Lake, we don't want to have sedimentation or polluted waters or high phosphorus going in. Sammamish has had a 80% removal for phosphorus as a requirement rather than 50% like everybody else does for these lakes, and it's really been working over the years, so people's septics and things can't do that. So what I would like is that on the fifth bullet, it would say, must not be encumbered by critical areas, which it already does, and then say critical drainage areas, which would be this area. And then if we're going to look at drains to areas, the erosion hazard, this purple thing, is an erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies. That was defined first by King County in 1994 under East Lake Sammamish Basin Plan and Non-Point Action Plan. And that is unique to Sammamish. It's not in any other the other cities around, and they're changing some of the regulations with David under critical areas this year. But if we're going to do the drains to landslide, I think we should also do the drains to erosion hazard. And then the last one is, if you're going to look there, is there anything that you need to do in the lake areas? Because the reason that Danica used a different color for these is the blue areas really aren't that sloped. And as soon as you're going about 4 or 5, 10% slope, you need to start worrying about the geohazards. So in these areas, we shouldn't be doing rezones to try to get more development because you're not even supposed to develop in critical areas anyway. And then the drains to are the first places where you need to say, hey, these are special areas, they need special regulations. So I don't think it, on any of the maps I've seen, I don't think any of the middle housing overlays are in these areas, but I'd like to have it in the code that you can't really do it in critical areas and you can't do it in the drains too, and that would include the landslide hazard drainage area, potentially include the erosion hazard near sensitive water body drains to area, and even potentially include around Beaver Lake and Pine Lake. But since I don't live by those lakes, I don't know if it's appropriate. Somebody else would have to opine on that. But that's my update for this. I would like to see that included in your consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Paul?
I truly do have something short tonight. Paul Stickney, Sammamish. A couple questions regarding real estate and city on the unit lot divisions, is that what they're called? Do they follow regular subdivision standards? Like a short plat or a long plat, or is it a different set of standards? Another question, would they be subject to a affordable housing percentage? And will single-family housing in the future get a part of affordable housing that is inclusionary rather than just multifamily like Redmond does? And are they truly autonomous like single-family homes where, yes, maybe you have HOA covenants in a single-family home, but you sort of have a lot of control over your own small site? But a lot of the projects in Seattle that are on the L-zoned properties, which are similar to this, they have common rules. It's not a condo, but it's a lot more sets of rules. So I don't need the answer yet. I'm just curious, to what degree is there another overlay of involvement with your neighbors as opposed to you managing your own house or not? And those are the questions I have on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I think a couple of those are good future topics. That should be everybody unless there's somebody online. No? Okay. Evan, anything else?
Two quick things. Just a reminder, we have set a special meeting for August 29th. We'll be bringing back the Transportation Master Plan tentatively for their public hearing, and then also, again, visiting with the development regs. And then I also just wanted to say thank you as the city's project manager for the comp plan update. I just did a quick count. Tonight was our 22nd meeting with the Planning Commission on the comp plan since this project started.
Gosh, it only felt like 50.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a big lift. Thank you all for the hard work on that. It feels really good that we have pushed it off now to the city council. So thank you.
Make sure they do as good a job as we did. All right. Anything else from anybody? Otherwise, if you would move. No. Next meeting is a month away-ish, August 29th. If someone would move to adjourn, that would be great.
After 2 extensions of 1 hour each, I'm happy to make a motion to adjourn.
Okay, it's been moved to second that we adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Thanks, everybody, for hanging around. Have a great summer. Watch the Olympics, and we'll see you at the end of August.